Welcome to your Q&A review for the WGU Enterprise Risk Management exam. We'll work through exam-style questions explaining why each answer is right, why others fall short, and the reasoning behind it. Today we cover Domain 1, Risk, Culture, and Risk Standards, including what risk truly means, the ISO standard definition of risk, Enterprise versus use siloed risk management, risk culture and its key traits, the 5-step model for risk culture, the 6-step risk management process. Our website is packed with free exam guides and practice questions designed to help you ace your D368 exam. Everything you need is right there, ready and waiting for you to use. Just click the link below, dive right in and start studying smarter, not harder, to get the results you're aiming for. Alright, let's get started. Question 1. A regional bakery chain sets a goal of growing revenue 8% this year by opening 2 new locations. Leadership lists events that could affect that goal, including a landlord backing out of a lease and a sharp increase in flour prices. A consultant notes that neither event would have counted as a risk to the company a year earlier, when no expansion goal existed. What does the consultant's point identify as essential to the definition of risk? Your options are A. An insurance policy that covers the event before it occurs. B. A record of how often the event has happened in the past. C. A stated objective that the event could affect. D. A dollar estimate of the loss the event would cause. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is C. A stated objective that the event could affect. C is correct because risk is defined as the probability of an event that can affect the achievement of objectives, so the objective is what turns an uncertain event into a risk. Remove the expansion goal and the lease or flour price events have nothing to threaten. This is why the same external event can be a risk to one organization and irrelevant to another. A is wrong because insurance is a response option that shifts financial consequence to a third party, not a precondition for something to qualify as a risk. Uninsured events are still risks. B is wrong because historical frequency helps estimate likelihood during the measure step, but a first-time event with no history is still a risk. Frequency data supports assessment rather than defining the concept. D is wrong because quantifying impact happens after a risk has been identified. A risk exists before anyone has priced it, and many risks are never assigned a dollar figure at all. What actually makes something a risk? It is not just a bad event waiting to happen. It only becomes a risk once there is a goal it can threaten. 3 things have to be present at once: an event, a probability, and an objective. Strip any one of them away and what remains is not risk. A hurricane forming over the ocean is just a meteorological event with a probability attached. It only becomes a risk through the specific objective it could disturb, like a shipping schedule or a store opening. The same shortage of a specialty ingredient can be a serious risk to one bakery, a trivial footnote to a competitor, and an opportunity to a supplier. Nothing about the event changes across these 3 cases, only the objectives differ. That is why credible risk identification starts by writing down objectives first, then asking what could move performance away from them. The objective is what makes the whole exercise finite and possible to practice rather than just worry about. Question 2. A Treasury analyst tells the risk committee that next quarter's lease payment on corporate headquarters is a fixed amount written into a signed contract, and therefore should not be logged as a financial risk. Which element of the definition of risk supports the analyst's reasoning? Your options are: A. Risk requires genuine uncertainty about whether or how an event will play out. B. Risk requires a consequence that is negative rather than positive. C. Risk requires formal approval from the board before it can be registered. D. Risk requires an event that has already occurred at least once. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is A. Risk requires genuine uncertainty about whether or how an event will play out. A is correct because uncertainty is a state in which information about an event, its consequences, or its likelihood is incomplete. A contractually fixed payment carries no such incompleteness, so there is a known outcome to plan around rather than a risk to manage. Where certainty is genuine, the item belongs in the budget rather than the risk register. B is wrong because formal risk management treats risk as two-sided, so a positive deviation from expectations still counts as risk. Requiring a negative consequence would exclude opportunity risk entirely. C is wrong because board approval is a governance activity and has no bearing on whether something meets the definition of risk. Risks exist whether or not anyone has formally logged them. D is wrong because many significant risks have never occurred before, which is exactly why they are hard to estimate. Requiring prior occurrence would exclude emerging risks from the register. To belong on a risk register, something must be genuinely uncertain, not just large or unwelcome. A signed lease obligation is a certain budgeted cash outflow. It is not a risk. Uncertainty means information is incomplete, and that incompleteness can attach to three different things: whether the event happens, how big the consequence is, or when it occurs. Organizations often mishandle the middle case, dropping a near certain event like a contract expiration off the register just because the date is known, while the true exposure sits in the unknown renewal terms. There is a mirror image mistake, logging something as a risk simply because nobody looked it up, like an unknown insurance deductible. That is ignorance cured by a phone call, not genuine uncertainty which survives even after diligent inquiry. Watch for the language. Words like guaranteed, contractually fixed already occurred, and known amount signal certainty. Words like may, could, is expected to, depending on, and if signal that the outcome is genuinely open. Genuine uncertainty justifies scenario planning and early warning metrics. Certainties just need budgeting and scheduling. What matters is whether the future is genuinely open, not how much data exists about it. Question 3. A warehouse fire destroys inventory at a distribution center. During the after-action review, a manager states, "The fire was our risk." The risk manager corrects the framing for the group. Which correction is consistent with how this course defines risk? Your options are: A, the fire was the objective and the destroyed inventory was the risk. B, the fire counted as a risk only because the inventory was uninsured. C, the fire became a risk at the moment the loss was recorded in the ledger. D, the risk was the uncertainty before the fact about whether a fire would occur and how it would affect objectives. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is D. The risk was the uncertainty before the fact about whether a fire would occur and how it would affect objectives. D is correct because risk lives in the space before an event, where the probability and the consequence are both still unresolved. Once the fire happens, it is an event, and then a loss, not a risk. Confusing the realized loss with the risk collapses the forward-looking nature of the whole discipline. A is wrong because an objective is something the organization is trying to achieve, such as maintaining fulfillment capacity. A fire is an event, and destroyed inventory is a consequence, so both labels are misapplied here. B is wrong because insurance status affects which response was chosen and how much of the financial consequence the organization retained. It does not determine whether the underlying uncertainty qualified as a risk. C is wrong because recording a loss is an accounting act that happens after the fact. Risk exists in advance of the event, which is what makes identification and measurement possible in the first place. A warehouse burns, inventory is destroyed, and a manager says the fire itself was the risk. That sounds reasonable, but it's backward. And getting this right is what separates anticipating from merely explaining. The risk was never the fire. The risk was the uncertainty before the fire about whether it would happen, how bad it would be, and what it would do to the organization's goals. Once flames appear, that uncertainty resolves, and everything after is just downstream fact. Risk management only operates in the window before resolution, because that's the only place 4 responses exist: avoid, reduce, transfer, or accept. Once the event happens, none of those choices remain. What's left is incident response, claims, and recovery. Threat, incident, and loss are close cousins that cause confusion. A threat is a potential source of harm. An incident is the realized occurrence, and a loss is the quantified consequence. Risk sits before all 3 in the interval where the outcome is still genuinely open. A company that patches one failed supplier but never asks what else is single-sourced is managing loss history, not risk. Watch for that tense shift on exam questions. The real answer is almost always the prior uncertainty, not the destroyed asset or recorded loss. Question 4. A newly hired analyst is asked to state the working definition of risk that the organization uses throughout its ERM policy. Which statement matches the course definition? Your options are: A. Any event that produces a financial loss for the organization. B. The probability of an event that can affect the achievement of objectives. C. The total value of losses recorded during a fiscal year. D. A hazard that management has chosen not to insure against. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is B. The probability of an event that can affect the achievement of objectives. B is correct because this is the working definition the course leads with, and each part carries weight. An event supplies the thing that may or may not happen. Probability supplies genuine uncertainty, and objectives supply the reason anyone cares. All 3 have to be present. A is wrong because restricting risk to financial loss drops both non-financial consequences and the upside half of risk. Reputational and strategic risks would fall outside the definition. C is wrong because aggregate annual losses describe outcomes that have already been realized. That is loss history, which informs risk assessment but is not itself the definition of risk. D is wrong because insurance status describes a response decision made after a risk has been identified and measured. Insured and uninsured exposures are both risks. Risk is the probability of an event that can affect the achievement of objectives. This definition is short, but every word in it is doing real work. And skipping one leads to nearly every mistake that follows. Probability means risk is forward-looking and sits on a continuum, not a yes or no. Event rules out vague things like weaknesses, trends, or concerns. You must name what would actually happen. And the phrase, affect the achievement of objectives, ties the event to a specific goal, using the neutral word affect rather than harm, because risk can also mean exceeding a target, not just falling short. Compare 2 register entries. Supply chain concerns cannot be measured, owned, or responded to, so it sits there doing nothing. A single source supplier fails. Delaying production and risking the launch date names an actual event implies a probability and ties directly to an objective. Exam-style traps usually drop one element. Restricting risk to financial loss erases non-financial impact and upside. Using past losses instead of future uncertainty puts risk on the wrong side of the event. And a hazard with no objective attached leaves out the tether that makes the concept usable. The course definition and the international standards effects of uncertainty on objectives aren't rivals. Both keep objectives central. The standards word effect just makes the two-sided nature of risk explicit, while the course version leaves it implied. Holding both views together serves you better than picking just one. Question 5. During an onboarding session, a facilitator flips a coin and asks the group whether the flip represents risk. No money, decision, or goal depends on the outcome. What is the most accurate response? Your options are it is randomness rather than risk because no objective depends on the outcome. B. It is risk because the outcome is uncertain until the coin lands. C. It is risk because the probability of each outcome can be calculated precisely. D. It is neither because probabilities that are evenly split fall outside risk management. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is A. It is randomness rather than risk because no objective depends on the outcome. A is correct because uncertainty alone is not enough to create risk. Risk requires that the uncertain event bear on something the organization is trying to achieve, and an idle coin flip is tethered to nothing. Attach a wager or a decision to the flip, and the same event immediately becomes a risk. B is wrong because uncertainty is one of the three required elements, not the whole definition. Without an objective in play, there is nothing for the uncertain outcome to affect. C is wrong because being able to calculate a probability makes an event measurable, not risky. Measurability supports assessment once a risk exists, but it does not create one. D is wrong because nothing in the definition of risk excludes events with evenly split probabilities. A 50-50 outcome tied to a real objective would be a substantial risk. A coin flip looks like risk, but it isn't. It's randomness, uncertainty with nothing attached to it. Risk only appears the moment that uncertainty touches something an organization is trying to achieve. Put a wager on that same flip and risk appears instantly with zero change to the physics of the coin. The property that makes something a risk isn't located in the event at all. It's located in the relationship between the event and a goal. Organizations are surrounded by uncertainty that never touches them. Currency markets moving for a firm in one currency. Commodity swings for a business that buys none. Regulation shifting where a company doesn't operate. None of that belongs on the register until a new objective, like deciding to export, converts that same background noise into live exposure. Consider a software company that sells only to private clients for years, then wins its first state agency contract. Procurement rules, records requirements, and audit expectations existed the whole time. But the moment the contract was signed, holding that new objective, a substantial category of compliance risk came into existence. Volatility is how much something fluctuates, a property of the thing itself, measurable without reference to anyone's plans. Exposure is how much a particular organization is affected, which requires an objective and a position. A market can be wildly volatile while a firm holds zero exposure. Plenty of randomness, no risk on that register. Question 6. A compliance officer is drafting a risk policy and wants to cite the definition of risk used by the leading international standard for risk management rather than an internal paraphrase. Which wording should be cited? Your options are A. The probability that a hazard causes harm to an organization. B. The measurable financial exposure created by an unplanned event. C. The effect of uncertainty on objectives. D. The difference between expected losses and insured losses. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is C. The effect of uncertainty on objectives. C is correct because this is the ISO 31000 definition, and its three load-bearing words are effect, uncertainty, and objectives. Effect means a deviation from what was expected, which can run in either direction. That single word is what makes the standard's view of risk two-sided rather than purely hazard-focused. A is wrong because framing risk around hazard and harm captures only the downside. The standard deliberately allows the effect of uncertainty to be positive, negative, or both. B is wrong because limiting risk to measurable financial exposure would exclude strategic, reputational, and compliance risks that resist clean quantification. It also ignores the objectives element entirely. D is wrong because this describes retained exposure, an insurance concept about how much consequence the organization keeps. It is a narrow financing idea rather than a definition of risk. Insurers, bankers, engineers, and safety regulators each built their own vocabulary for risk, so a single company could hold 4 definitions that never lined up. ISO 31000 was published to fix that, and its core definition is the most heavily tested idea in the field. The definition is only 8 words, but 3 of them do all the work. Effect means a deviation from what was expected, uncertainty means incomplete information, and objectives means the actual goals the organization is pursuing. The word effect is chosen deliberately because it refuses to commit to a direction. A deviation from expectations can be worse than expected, better than expected, or both at once, which is why the standard rejects treating risk as a synonym for threat. If risk only meant the chance of something bad, the rational target would be zero risk, achievable only by doing nothing at all. No new product, no new market, no new hire. That is exactly why serious organizations manage risk instead of minimizing it, and why every register entry should trace back to a named objective. Exam wording tests near misses. Probability of a bad outcome drops the upside. Measurable financial exposure drops non-financial objectives and uncertainty, and treating risk as a hazard collapses the concept into the event itself. Only the full phrase, a factor of uncertainty on objectives, keeps all 3 elements in place, and no paraphrase substitutes for it. Question 7. A hospital system, a software startup, and a city government all adopt ISO 31000. Each ends up with a visibly different risk management approach, and none of the 3 receives a certificate of compliance. Which characteristic of ISO 31000 best explains this? Your options are: A. The standard applies only to organizations in regulated industries. B. The standard is a guideline document meant to be tailored to an organization's context rather than a certification. C. The standard requires a separate accredited audit before certification can be issued. D. The standard sets fixed numerical thresholds that each sector interprets differently. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is B. The standard is a guideline document meant to be tailored to an organization's context rather than a certification. B is correct because ISO 31000 provides guidelines and principles for designing, implementing, maintaining, and improving risk management in any organization, regardless of size, industry, or sector. It is built to be customized, which is why 3 very different organizations applying it correctly will not look alike. There is no certification to earn against it. A is wrong because the standard is explicitly written for any organization regardless of sector, so regulated status is irrelevant. Unregulated firms adopt it routinely. C is wrong because the absence of certification is not a procedural gap waiting to be filled by an audit. Certification is simply not part of how the standard works. D is wrong because the standard does not prescribe numerical thresholds at all. It supplies principles, a framework, and a process, leaving the organization to set its own measures. A common myth is that organizations get certified against ISO 31000 the way they would for a quality standard. That's wrong. And understanding why reveals what the standard actually is: a set of guidelines, not a checklist to pass. There is no certificate to earn, no accredited body to award one, and no pass mark. The standard simply offers guidelines for designing, implementing, and improving risk management over time. A hospital, a software startup, and a city government differ wildly in scale, regulation, and decision speed. So a rigid document specific enough to certify would fit none of them well. The standard trades enforceability for universality on purpose. The standard organizes its guidance around three connected elements. Principles answer why risk management matters and what good practice looks like. The framework answers who is responsible and how it's built into governance. The process answers how a given risk actually gets managed, step by step. Borrowing another organization's risk structure wholesale actually violates the standard because context, size, culture, regulation should shape the approach. Treating AWIA's Oath 31,000 as a checklist produces paperwork without practice. Treating it as a guideline produces a risk function that truly fits. Question 8. A new Chief Risk Officer maps her department's work against the three connected elements of ISO 31000. She is currently documenting who is accountable for risk management and how risk activity gets built into governance and everyday decisions. Which element is she working on? Your options are A. Principles, B. Process, C. The risk register, D. Framework. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is D. Framework. D is correct because the framework element answers who is responsible and how risk management gets integrated into governance and daily decision making. Assigning accountability and wiring risk into existing decision routines is framework work by definition. It sits between the purpose stated in the principles and the step-by-step activity of the process. A is wrong because principles answer why risk management is worth doing and what qualities good risk management should have, such as being integrated, dynamic, and inclusive. They do not name accountable parties. B is wrong because the process element is the step-by-step activity of managing a specific risk once it has surfaced. Documenting organizational accountability sits above any individual risk. C is wrong because a risk register is a running log of identified risks with descriptions and categories produced during identification. It is an output rather than one of the standard's three elements. ISO 31000 is more than a definition of risk. It's built around three connected elements, and each one answers a different question, which is exactly what exam questions probe. Principles answer why risk management matters. Framework answers who holds accountability and how it fits into governance. Process answers what to do about one specific risk. Confusing these three is the reliable way to lose points. The principles element sits above the rest and describes qualities, not activities. Risk management should be integrated, structured, and comprehensive, customized to context, inclusive of stakeholders, dynamic, well-informed, attentive to human factors, and continually improving. When a program feels busy but ineffective, checking it against these qualities usually finds the problem. The clearest test is what an activity operates on. If it operates on the organization, like assigning roles or wiring risk into a decision gate, that's framework. If it operates on one specific risk, like rating a supplier failure, that's process. Watch for the trap. The word integrated points to framework, not process. And a risk register is just an output of identification, belonging to none of the three. Keep this separate from the course's own 6-step sequence, where the own step maps to accountability, a framework matter, not a process step. That's not a contradiction. Just two vocabularies the exam expects you to speak fluently. Question 9. A manufacturer's risk team invites plant supervisors, procurement staff, and frontline maintenance technicians into its annual risk identification workshop, reasoning that their first-hand knowledge surfaces exposures the central team would never see. Which ISO 31000 principle does this practice reflect? Your options are inclusive, B. Structured and comprehensive, C. Continual improvement, D. Best available information. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is A. Inclusive. A is correct because the inclusive principle holds that appropriate stakeholders should be involved because their knowledge and perspective improve risk identification. Pulling in the people closest to the work is the direct application of that idea. The reasoning given in the scenario, that these participants see what the central team misses, is the principle stated almost word for word. B is wrong because structured and comprehensive refers to using a consistent, organized approach so results are comparable and reliable. That describes how the workshop is run, not who is invited. C is wrong because continual improvement means risk management gets better over time through learning and experience. Nothing in the scenario describes refining the approach based on past cycles. D is wrong because best available information means drawing on the best historical and current data with awareness of its limits. It concerns the quality of inputs rather than the breadth of participation. A pump had been running hot for months and a technician knew it, but nobody asked him. That's not a data failure. It's a participation failure, and it's exactly what the inclusive principle addresses. The inclusive principle says the right stakeholders should be involved because their knowledge improves risk identification. This works two ways: coverage, where more people surface more risks, and calibration, where people closest to the work correct the register's estimates based on near misses a central team never sees. Picture the central team compiling reports on one side, and the technician who watched the pump overheat on the other with no bridge between them. That gap is exactly what the inclusive principle exists to close. Appropriate is the key word. Inviting everyone to every workshop produces theatre, while inviting too few produces blind spots. The right participants depend on the topic. A cyber risk session needs technology staff. A supply chain session needs procurement and operations. Inclusive is about who's in the room. Best available information is about the evidence. Structured and comprehensive is about method. A register can be well run and well informed and still fail if the guest list was wrong. Question 10. An insurer reviews its risk profile once every 3 years on the argument that its exposures are stable. Across that gap, a new competitor enters the market, a state regulation changes, and customer buying behavior shifts, none of which reaches the risk register. Which ISO 31000 principle is the insurer failing to apply? Your options are inclusive, B, customized, C, dynamic, D, structured and comprehensive. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is C, dynamic. C is correct because the dynamic principle holds that risk changes as the organization and its environment change. So the approach has to keep up. A 3-year review cycle assumes a stability the environment does not actually offer. Every missed item in the scenario is a change the risk process never registered because it was not looking. Is wrong because the inclusive principle concerns involving appropriate stakeholders in risk work. The failure here is timing and responsiveness, not who participated. B is wrong because customize means scaling and tailoring the approach to the organization's own context rather than copying someone else's. The insurer's problem is not that its approach was borrowed. D is wrong because structured and comprehensive concerns consistency and organization, so results are comparable. A rigid 3-year cadence is arguably consistent, which is precisely why it fails on a different principle. Risk changes constantly, but risk reviews usually happen on a slow, fixed schedule. When those two rhythms fall out of sync, a risk register drifts quietly out of alignment with reality, with no visible mistake to point to. Change arrives from two directions. External change includes competitors, regulation, technology, and customer behavior. Internal change includes acquisitions, product launches, reorganizations, and leadership turnover. The internal side is easier to overlook because it originates inside the organization, which creates a false sense that it's already understood. A stale assessment carries the authority of a formal document but none of the accuracy of current conditions. The real problem is not missing information. It's outdated information wearing the credibility of something current. In practice, dynamic risk management combines a scheduled cycle with triggered reviews. Defined events like entering a market, a major incident, or a big regulatory change force a reassessment regardless of the calendar. Programs relying only on the scheduled half will always lag change by up to a full cycle. Continual improvement is about getting better at risk management over time. Dynamic is about keeping today's view of risk aligned with today's conditions. A program can be improving its methods while still describing a world that no longer exists. Question 11. A hospital system's chief executive tells the board, "Our entire philosophy is zero risk. Patient safety comes first, so we simply do not take risks here." A risk consultant in the room pushes back on the framing. What is the strongest basis for the consultant's objection? Your options are: A. Healthcare organizations are exempt from formal risk management standards. B. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives and includes upside as well as downside, so zero risk is neither attainable nor desirable. C. Patient safety does not qualify as an organizational objective in risk terms. D. Zero risk is achievable but requires a larger risk department than the system currently funds. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is B. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives and includes upside as well as downside. So zero risk is neither attainable nor desirable. B is correct because the formal definition allows the effect of uncertainty to be positive, negative, or both. A hospital operating at literal zero risk would never adopt a new treatment protocol, open a new service line, or hire a promising but unproven specialist. The right reframing is not eliminating risk but taking the right risks knowingly within defined limits. E is wrong because no such exemption exists, and the standard is written to apply to any organization regardless of sector. Healthcare systems are among the heaviest users of formal risk management. C is wrong because patient safety is a textbook organizational objective, and objectives are exactly what risk is measured against. Denying that would remove the anchor the whole definition depends on. D is wrong because zero risk is not a resourcing problem that a bigger department could solve. Eliminating all uncertainty would also eliminate every chance of an outcome better than expected. Zero risk sounds like the safest promise a hospital executive can make. But a risk consultant hears something else entirely, a promise that cannot be kept and shouldn't be. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, and effect can run either direction, good or bad. So zero risk demands zero uncertainty, which means never trying anything whose outcome isn't already known. No new protocol, no new specialist, no unproven equipment. Every one of those is something a hospital devoted to patients would want to pursue, which is why zero risk doesn't sit on the safe end of a spectrum at all. It sits outside the spectrum for closing the progress patient care depends on. Consider a hospital deciding whether to adopt a newer surgical technique with strong but limited evidence. Adopting it carries uncertainty, but declining it also carries uncertainty, since patients keep receiving an older approach with known limitations. The zero-risk framing hides that second risk by pretending inaction is neutral. The real commitment is harder. Take the right risks knowingly within defined limits in service of the mission, and manage the downside deliberately. Note this is different from risk aversion, which prices risk high but still trades. Zero risk prices it as infinite, refusing to trade at all. Question 12. A heavy equipment manufacturer enters a new export market. Doing so exposes the company to currency swings and shipping delays. But it also opens the possibility that demand in that market outruns what the factory can currently build. Which idea does this situation best illustrate? Your options are A. Risk transfer through contractual indemnification. B. The distinction between governance and management. C. A failure of the monitoring step. D. The two-sided nature of risk, where the same uncertainty carries downside and upside. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is D. The two-sided nature of risk, where the same uncertainty carries downside and upside. D is correct because the currency swings and the demand surge come from a single source, which is uncertainty about the future relative to the company's objectives. One direction threatens the objective and the other overshoots it, and both are risk. This is why organizations pursue uncertainty deliberately instead of trying to stamp it out. A is wrong, because transfer is a specific response that shifts financial consequence to a third party through insurance or contract terms. No such arrangement appears in the scenario. B is wrong because governance and management describe the split between oversight and day-to-day operation. The scenario is about the character of the exposure, not who is accountable for it. C is wrong because monitoring is the ongoing tracking of a risk and its response after implementation. Nothing here suggests a control was put in place and then neglected. When a manufacturer enters an export market, currency swings, shipping delays, and demand surges all seem like separate problems. But they trace back to one single source: uncertainty about a market the company has never operated in. The formal definition calls risk the effect of uncertainty on objectives. An effect deliberately doesn't specify a direction. A deviation from what you expected can run worse, better, or both at once, depending on the objective. Downside and upside aren't different phenomena. They're two directions of travel from the same origin. The habit of treating risk as only bad has a traceable origin. Risk management grew out of insurance, which only concerns itself with losses it can price and pay for. That heritage left a vocabulary tilted entirely toward hazard. And enterprise risk management corrected that tilt on purpose. Picture the manufacturer again. Demand doubles projections, but the factory can only supply half. Competitors fill the gap and lock in relationships that are expensive to break later. No loss shows up on the financial statements. Yet, the objective of building a durable position has been missed just as thoroughly as a currency shock would have missed it. Recognizing upside risk isn't optimism. It's discipline, capacity planning, supplier flexibility, and hiring ladder time so a favorable surprise doesn't go to waste. A profile that lists only threats hasn't captured risk at all. It's just written down a list of worries. Question 13. A newly appointed risk manager is asked why the organization does not simply set a target of reducing every risk on the register to its lowest possible level. Which explanation best captures the reasoning behind the phrase "no risk, no reward"? Your options are A. Reducing risk is prohibited unless the board approves each reduction individually. B. Risk reduction is always more expensive than the losses it prevents. C. Zero risk means zero uncertainty, which also removes any chance of an outcome better than expected. D. Most risks disappear on their own if the organization waits long enough. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is C. Zero risk means zero uncertainty, which also removes any chance of an outcome better than expected. C is correct because uncertainty is the source of both the downside and the upside, so eliminating it eliminates both. An organization with no uncertainty has no new markets, no new products, and no growth. Enterprise risk management is about deciding which risks are worth taking on purpose, not about driving every exposure towards zero. A is wrong because no approval rule of that kind exists, and reduction is one of the 4 standard responses available to a risk owner. The constraint described is invented. B is wrong because reduction is sometimes worth its cost and sometimes not. which is why response selection weighs cost against benefit. Claiming that is always uneconomic overstates the case badly. D is wrong because risks change as conditions change. But waiting is not a strategy, and unmanaged risks frequently grow rather than fade. Accepting a risk deliberately is different from ignoring it. No risk, no reward isn't a motivational slogan. In enterprise risk management, it's a structural fact. Uncertainty is the source of both the downside and the upside, so removing it removes both. If an organization eliminated all uncertainty, it would only pursue activities with outcomes already known, and results anyone can know are results anyone can copy. That competes away the margin, which is why returns above ordinary only exist where outcomes are still uncertain. The counterweight is risk appetite. How much risk the organization will accept in pursuit of its objectives. Inside that boundary, taking risk is expected behavior needing no approval. Outside it, the same behavior requires escalation. Without a stated appetite, every risk conversation collapses into personal temperament. The distinction worth protecting is between accepting risk and ignoring it. An accepted risk is identified, measured, owned, and consciously retained within appetite, sitting on the register under monitoring, while an ignored risk has none of that. A bank that declines to lend into a new segment hasn't chosen safety over risk. It has chosen a different risk profile, one that concentrates its portfolio and seeds growth. Enterprise risk management isn't about minimizing exposure. It's about deciding which risks are worth carrying. Question 14. While reviewing multiple choice practice items, a student notices several answer choices that treat reduce the risk as the correct move in every scenario regardless of context. What does this pattern most likely signal about those choices? Your options are: A. They reflect the common misunderstanding of risk as purely negative, which formal risk management rejects. B. They correctly apply the ISO 31000 principle of continual improvement. C. They describe the ownership step of the risk management process. D. They demonstrate proper alignment between risk response and risk appetite. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is A. They reflect the common misunderstanding of risk as purely negative, which formal risk management rejects. A is correct because treating reduction as automatically correct assumes risk is always a threat to be minimized. Formal risk management treats risk as two-sided and expects deliberate risk-taking within limits in pursuit of objectives. The stronger answer in these scenarios usually reflects a considered choice among avoid, reduce, transfer, and accept rather than a reflex. B is wrong because continual improvement concerns getting better at risk management through learning and experience over time. It says nothing about which response is appropriate for a given exposure. C is wrong because ownership is the assignment of a named accountable person or function to a risk. Choosing reduction is a response decision, which is a separate step. D is wrong because alignment with appetite is precisely what a reflexive reduce everything stance skips. A response is aligned only when it accounts for where the risk sits relative to stated appetite. There's a pattern worth learning to spot. Someone identifies a risk and reaches immediately for reduce. Add a control, tighten a process, require another approval. It feels responsible, but it often skips the analysis that should choose among 4 equal responses. The reflex has a social source, not an analytical one. Reduction is the response that looks like effort in a meeting, while avoidance can read as timidity, transfer as passing the buck, and acceptance as doing nothing at all. Underneath the social dynamic is a conceptual error. If risk only means something bad, less is always better. But once risk means uncertainty affecting objectives in either direction, the question becomes whether current exposure fits the goal, and every control has a cost that must be weighed against it. Picture a distributor that responds to one mispriced order with dual authorization on every quote. Sales cycle time lengthens by 2 days, and 3 months later, the win rate on competitive bids has slipped. But nobody connects the two because the control lives on a risk register and the win rate lives in a sales report. Prudence is a real virtue, and it sometimes yields a new control and sometimes yields a decision to knowingly carry an exposure. The reflex skips the weighing entirely, but the goal was never caution for its own sake. It's a defensible match between exposure and objective. Question 15. A bakery chain's social media post goes unexpectedly viral, and orders climb far faster than the ovens at 2 locations can fill them. Customers wait, some cancel, and the chain's growth objective is affected. How should this event be classified? Your options are A. Not a risk because the underlying event was favorable publicity. B. A risk because uncertainty about demand affected the achievement of an objective. C. Not a risk because no financial loss was recorded. D. A risk only if the chain had purchased business interruption coverage. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is B. A risk because uncertainty about demand affected the achievement of an objective. B is correct because risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, and the effect here runs through demand the organization could not serve. Upside events create risk exactly the way downside events do when the organization is unprepared for them. Opportunity that cannot be captured is a genuine deviation from expectations. A is wrong because favorable publicity does not disqualify an event from being a risk, because the effect of uncertainty can be positive, negative, or both. Framing risk as only bad news is the misunderstanding formal practice corrects. C is wrong because losing sales to unmet demand is a real consequence whether or not it appears as a recorded loss. Tying the definition to accounting entries would exclude most strategic risk. D is wrong because insurance coverage determines who bears financial consequence after an event. It has no bearing on whether the underlying uncertainty qualified as a risk. A bakery's decorating video goes viral. Orders triple overnight, ovens can't keep up, wait times spike, and some customers leave for good. Nothing bad happened here, yet this is a textbook case of risk. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, not simply harm. The bakery's demand uncertainty resolved in its favor, but because the organization couldn't absorb it, performance still moved away from what was intended. Downside events come with built-in defenses, insurance, contingency plans, incident response. Upside events sneak in through channels nobody watches. And fixing them means expanding capability fast. Ovens, staff, and suppliers can't scale in 48 hours. Opportunity and upside risk overlap but aren't identical. An opportunity is a favorable possibility to pursue. Upside risk is the effect on objectives when that favorable uncertainty resolves, including when the organization fails to capture the benefit. A mishandled surge can leave a brand worse off than if it never happened. Organizations that run favorable scenario planning, flexible suppliers, fast capacity options, convert good luck into results better than equally lucky competitors who didn't. Question 16. 2 members of a risk committee are using the terms likelihood and impact interchangeably during a review. Which statement correctly separates them? Your options are A. Likelihood is the cost of a control and impact is the residual exposure after the control is applied. B. Likelihood is set by the board and impact is set by the risk owner. C. Likelihood applies to downside risk and impact applies to upside risks. D. Likelihood is how probable the event is over a defined period, and impact is how large the deviation from objectives would be if it occurred. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is D. Likelihood is how probable the event is over a defined period, and impact is how large the deviation from objectives would be if it occurred. D is correct because these are the two dimensions the measure step uses to make risk comparable against one another. Likelihood addresses probability across a stated time horizon, and impact addresses severity of the deviation from objectives. Holding them separate is what makes prioritization across a full register possible. A is wrong because control cost and residual exposure are useful concepts but belong to response selection and post-treatment assessment. Neither is what likelihood or impact means. B is wrong because neither dimension is defined by who assigns it. Both are estimates about the risk itself, and both are typically developed by management with input from the risk function. C is wrong because both dimensions apply to any risk regardless of direction. Splitting them by upside and downside has no basis in the framework. With 50 items on a risk register, identifying risks isn't enough. You need a shared way to compare them. Enterprise Risk Management uses two dimensions that make unlike exposures rankable against each other. Likelihood is how probable an event is over a defined period, and that time horizon isn't optional, since almost anything becomes likely given enough time. Mature programs fix a common horizon, often a year, and rate every risk against it. Impact or severity is how large the deviation from objectives would be. Dollars are a convenient proxy, but forcing every impact into currency underweights risks that are regulatory, reputational, clinical, or strategic. Each dimension corrects a distortion in the other. Likelihood alone promotes the frequent and trivial. Impact alone promotes the catastrophic and nearly impossible. But together they produce a defensible ordering that makes a risk map readable. Watch for inconsistent scales across functions. If one group's high means something different than another's, any combined risk map is fiction. And remember, exposure and velocity are related but distinct ideas that don't substitute for likelihood and impact. Question 17. A retailer's risk team plots each item on its register against two axes and produces a single visual that leadership can scan in under a minute to see which exposures deserve attention first. What is this tool called and what is its purpose? Your options are A risk map used to show relative priority by plotting likelihood against impact. B, a risk register used to log each risk with a description and category. C, an ERM policy used to document risk appetite and escalation requirements. D, a gap analysis used to compare current practice against a desired future state. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is A, a risk map used to show relative priority by plotting likelihood against impact. A is correct because a risk map, also called a heat map, plots risks by likelihood and impact, so relative priority becomes visible at a glance. Its value is comparison, since an organization's attention and budget are limited and every risk on the register is competing for both. It turns a long list into a picture leadership can actually act on. B is wrong because the risk register is the running log produced by identification, holding descriptions and categories. It is the input to the map rather than the visual itself. C is wrong because an ERM policy is a governance document establishing appetite, roles, process, and reporting requirements. It does not display individual risks by severity. D is wrong because gap analysis compares a current state against a desired state and diagnoses why they differ. That belongs to culture building, not to risk prioritization. 50 rows of likelihood and impact ratings will never change a decision, because nobody scans a spreadsheet looking for a pattern. The risk map solves that problem by turning the table into a picture a busy executive can read in under a minute. Each risk is plotted at the intersection of its likelihood and impact ratings. The high corner demands immediate attention. The low corner just needs logging. and the two mixed corners are where organizations most often get the judgment wrong. A cyber intrusion, a key person departure, a regulatory change, and a supplier bankruptcy share nothing operationally, but plotted on the same likelihood impact field. They become directly comparable for allocating attention. That comparison only works if every function uses consistent scales when supplying its ratings. The temptation is to scan only the likelihood axis and call the top the priority list. But that misreads the mixed corners. A rare, devastating event and a frequent, merely annoying one occupy very different positions, and probability alone captures neither correctly. The register is the running log of identified risks, built during identification. The map is the visual built from it once likelihood and impact are assessed. One shows what exposures exist, the other shows which deserve attention first, and neither replaces judgments about risk compounding together. Question 18. A food manufacturer's risk map places sole supplier of a key ingredient goes bankrupt at low likelihood and high impact. A manager argues the item should be dropped from the register because it almost certainly will not happen. What is the appropriate treatment? Your options are: A. Drop it, since likelihood is the primary axis for prioritization. B. Reclassify it as high likelihood so it receives attention. C. Keep it and build a contingency plan because the severity alone can threaten the objective. D. Move it to the ERM policy rather than the risk register. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is C. Keep it and build a contingency plan because the severity alone can threaten the objective. C is correct because probably will not happen and would be fine if it did are two different statements, and only the second justifies ignoring a risk. Losing the ability to produce a core product is severe enough to warrant a qualified backup supplier regardless of the odds. Impact alone can justify preparation. A is wrong because treating likelihood as the axis that matters is the exact trap this quadrant is designed to expose. Both dimensions carry weight and severity can dominate. B is wrong because falsifying an assessment to force attention corrupts the register and destroys comparability across risks. The honest rating plus a contingency plan achieves the goal without the distortion. D is wrong because the ERM policy establishes appetite, roles, process, and escalation requirements rather than holding individual risk entries. Moving a risk there would simply remove it from active tracking. Probably won't happen and would be fine if it did are two completely different claims. But arguments for ignoring severe risk constantly slide from one to the other. Guarding against that slide takes deliberate effort. Consider a food manufacturer whose sole supplier looks financially sound with decades of stable history. If that supplier still collapsed, production halts. A replacement ingredient takes months to qualify in a regulated environment. Revenue stops, shelf space is lost, and retail relationships built over years are damaged. Severity doesn't care how unlikely the cause was. The fix is not to inflate the likelihood rating, just to force attention, since that corrupts the register and destroys comparability. The right move is to keep the honest rating and build a contingency plan, like qualifying a backup supplier, holding inventory buffer, or arranging a standby deal, because holding that option open costs little compared to what it saves. This quadrant is most often confused with its diagonal opposite. High likelihood, low impact is absorbed into routine process, since events are frequent and survivable. Low likelihood, high impact needs preparation without routine, because the event may never arrive but the organization must still be ready. Loss histories never contain the worst events, because those events hadn't happened before, so experience alone systematically underweights this exact category of risk. When a STEM offers removal or reclassification on probability grounds, the expected answer is retention plus a contingency plan. Question 19. A bakery chain's register includes minor equipment breakdowns at individual stores, rated high likelihood and low impact. The risk owner asks how this item should be handled relative to the register's severe exposures. Your options are: A. Escalated to the board at every meeting because of its high likelihood. B. Remove it since low impact items do not belong on a register. C. Purchase insurance covering each individual breakdown event. D. Handle it through normal maintenance routines without special escalation. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is D. Handle it through normal maintenance routines without special escalation. D is correct because frequent but minor events are absorbed by ordinary operating processes rather than by exceptional attention. The whole purpose of plotting likelihood against impact is to reserve scarce leadership attention for items where the combination justifies it. Routine handling is a legitimate outcome of prioritization, not neglect. A is wrong because board time is the scarcest resource in the organization and is reserved for aggregated exposure and material items. High likelihood by itself does not earn escalation. B is wrong because low impact risks stay on the register so they can be monitored for drift and so the picture stays complete. Removal would hide any trend toward greater severity. C is wrong because ensuring high frequency, low severity events cost more in premium and administration than the losses themselves. Transfer fits rare, severe exposures far better. A mixer motor breaks, a cooler fails, a register needs replacing. These are frequent minor events. And understanding why they need almost no special response teaches something bigger about risk registers. Frequent minor events are best absorbed by ordinary operating processes, a maintenance schedule, a spare parts budget, a service contract, and a clear procedure for store managers handle the entire category without any special escalation. The entry stays on the register for real reasons, watching for drift as impact quietly grows, keeping a complete picture of total operating burden, and preserving prioritization so leadership attention isn't wasted uniformly. The most common mistake is applying insurance here. Ensuring frequent small losses is close to guaranteed to cost more than the losses themselves, because administrative cost per claim dominates when claims are small and numerous. Contrast this with frequent and severe risk, which shares the likelihood axis but demands nearly any response cost. High likelihood alone means nothing until you know the impact beside it. Question 20. An analyst reviewing a completed risk map notices that every item receiving a formal response plan sits in the upper half of the probability axis, while severe but improbable exposures were all left unmanaged. Which error does this pattern reveal? Your options are: A. Confusing the risk register with the risk map. B. Over-relying on likelihood and under-prioritizing low-likelihood, high-impact risks. C. Assigning ownership before completing measurement. D. Treating implementation as the final step of the risk management process. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is B. Over-relying on likelihood and under-prioritizing low-likelihood, high-impact risks. B is correct because prioritizing by probability alone quietly discards the severity dimension, and the risks that suffer most are the rare catastrophic ones. These are the easiest to dismiss and the most dangerous to actually ignore. A map read correctly weighs both axes together rather than sorting down one of them. A is wrong because the register logs risks with descriptions and categories, while the map displays them by likelihood and impact. The analyst is reading the map correctly and objecting to how its results were used. C is wrong because sequencing between ownership and measurement is a process order question about the 6 steps. Nothing in this scenario indicates owners were named at the wrong time. D is wrong because treating implementation as a finish line is a monitoring failure that shows up after responses are executed. The problem here occurs earlier, at prioritization. A risk register can be measured perfectly and still fail, because prioritizing it is a separate step, and that step can quietly go wrong. When a register gets sorted by probability and reviewed from the top down, severity quietly disappears from the conversation. The rare, catastrophic exposures sink toward the bottom, not because anyone judged them unimportant, but because the sorting method never asked about impacts at all. Several tendencies push in this direction at once. People judge probability by how easily an example comes to mind. Rare events lack a loss history to make a rating feel defensible. Analysts hedge toward calling low likelihood negligible, and proposing costly preparation for something unlikely is a hard position to defend in a budget meeting. The fix is procedural, not attitudinal. Reviewing the map by quadrant rather than by a sorted list forces the severe and rare corner to be examined on its own terms, with an explicit decision required for anything above an impact threshold, regardless of likelihood. A correctly rated low probability risk can still leave an organization with no plan if low likelihood gets treated as low priority. The measurement worked, the prioritization is what failed. Question 21. At a mid-size manufacturer, the plant manager tracks safety incidents. The treasurer tracks currency exposure on overseas contracts. The IT team tracks phishing attempts, and legal tracks contract disputes. Each function uses its own severity scale and reports only to its own leadership. How is this approach best described? Your options are A. Siloed risk management, B. Enterprise risk management, C. A risk appetite statement, D. The monitoring step of the risk management process. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is A. Siloed risk management. A is correct because siloed risk management means individual departments manage the risks relevant to their own function independently, with little coordination, no shared language, and no aggregated view. Every marker is present here, including the separate severity scales that make cross-function comparison impossible. The work inside each silo may be competent, which is what makes the pattern easy to miss. B is wrong because enterprise risk management adds a coordinating layer with a common taxonomy, a shared measurement scale, and an aggregated picture that reaches senior management and the board. None of those exist in this scenario. C is wrong because a risk appetite statement declares how much risk the organization will accept in pursuit of its objectives. It is a policy element, not a description of organizational structure. D is wrong because monitoring is the ongoing tracking of specific risks and their responses after treatment. The scenario describes how risk work is organized, not a stage of the process. Siloed risk management is an approach where each department manages its own risks independently, with no shared language and no combined view across the organization. Picture a manufacturer where the plant manager tracks safety. The treasurer tracks currency exposure, technology tracks phishing attempts, and legal tracks disputes. Each does careful work, but none has visibility into what the others see. 3 characteristics follow from this structure. It's reactive, triggered by losses rather than foresight. It's hazard-focused, attending only to downside, and it's inconsistent, since each function picks its own scale for severity. Inconsistency is the deepest problem because it makes the others irreparable. If technology and finance define high impact differently, gathering their reports together produces only a binder, not a real enterprise view. The individual work in silos is often excellent. The failure is the missing layer that owns combined exposures. Enterprise risk management adds exactly that: shared taxonomy, common measurement, and one aggregated picture for leadership. Question 22. A single cyber attack at a distribution company produces a data breach, a regulatory penalty, and a wave of negative press. IT, legal, and communications each discover their own piece separately and slowly, and no one connects the three until a quarterly review months later. What is the most appropriate corrective direction? Your options are A. Add a second layer of technical controls inside the IT department. B. Reassign the regulatory penalty to legal's departmental budget. C. Instruct communications to monitor press coverage more frequently. D. Move toward an aggregated enterprise view with common language so compounding exposures become visible. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is D. Move toward an aggregated enterprise view with common language so compounding exposures become visible. D is correct because one event cascading unnoticed across three functions is the signature failure of siloed risk management, where blind spots live at the seams. The fix is structural rather than departmental because no single function could have seen the full picture. Aggregation and a shared taxonomy are what let leadership see correlation and concentration across risks before damage spreads. A is wrong because hardening IT addresses only the slice that happened to be the entry point. The failure was that three consequences of one event went uncorrelated, which more firewalls do not solve. B is wrong because moving a cost between budgets changes accounting rather than visibility. The organization would remain just as blind to the next compounding event. C is wrong because more frequent press monitoring improves one department's detection speed inside its own lane. That is another local control, not the integrated view the situation calls for. One intrusion, three consequences, three departments, and nobody connects the dots for months. This delay isn't a personnel failure, it's a structural one. Customer data gets exposed, a regulatory penalty follows, and trade press covers it for a week. Each function works its own piece competently and reports it up its own channel. But risks don't respect an org chart, and nobody connects the three until a quarterly review months later. Blind spots live at the seams between departments, exactly where no one is looking. If each function watches only its own dashboard, the compounding effect stays invisible until the damage is already enterprise-wide. Hardening the doorway that got breached addresses a control gap, but it does nothing about the real failure. Three consequences going uncorrelated for months. That's a visibility gap, and no amount of departmental strengthening closes it. The fix is aggregation with a common language. So leadership sees correlation across risks instead of four partial pictures that never meet. When a stem shows one event landing in several functions, discovered separately and slowly, the correct answer integrates the view. It doesn't add one more control inside whichever department got blamed. Question 23. A regional bank moves from siloed risk management to an enterprise approach. Its treasury team worries the change means treasury will lose responsibility for managing currency exposure. What is the most accurate response? Your options are A. Treasury's currency responsibility moves entirely to the Chief Risk Officer under an enterprise approach. B. Treasury continues to manage currency exposure, and the enterprise layer adds common language, common measurement, and an aggregated view above the specialists. C. Currency exposure stops being tracked because enterprise risk management focuses only on strategic risk. D. Treasury must convert its currency exposure into a form that legal can manage instead. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is B. Treasury continues to manage currency exposure, and the enterprise layer adds common language, common measurement, and an aggregated view above the specialists. B is correct because enterprise risk management does not eliminate specialists, and business units still own the risk closest to their work. What the enterprise layer adds is a shared taxonomy for describing risk, a consistent way of measuring it, and one aggregated picture that reaches senior management and the board. The specialist depth stays, and the coordination is what gets built on top. A is wrong because concentrating operational risk management in a single officer would strip out the expertise that makes assessment accurate. The risk function coordinates rather than absorbing every exposure. C is wrong because enterprise risk management widens scope to cover all risk types across all functions, including financial exposures like currency. Narrowing to strategic risk alone would be a step backward. D is wrong because handing an exposure to a function with no relevant expertise makes management worse, not more integrated. Ownership belongs with the party best positioned to act on it. When a bank moves to enterprise risk management, Treasury often worries it will lose control of currency exposure. That worry is misplaced, and seeing why reveals exactly what enterprise risk management changes and what it leaves alone. Enterprise risk management does not eliminate specialists. Treasury still manages currency exposure, technology still manages cyber risk, legal still manages contract risk, and business units still own the risk in their own operations, because ownership belongs with whoever understands the exposure best. What sits above the specialist is three specific things: a common taxonomy, so risks are described in compatible terms, a shared measurement approach, so ratings sit on the same scale, and a single aggregated picture for senior management and the board. The clearest way to see the division is by asking what question each level answers. Treasury answers what the exposure is and what to do about it. The enterprise layer answers how large it is relative to everything else, whether it correlates with other exposures, and whether it fits within the board's appetite. The confusion worth resolving is between ownership and coordination. Ownership means a named party is accountable for a risk. Coordination means somebody assembles the parts into a view of the whole. Enterprise risk management centralizes coordination while deliberately leaving ownership right where it was. Question 20. A logistics firm hires its first chief risk officer, gives her a small team, and issues a press release announcing its enterprise risk management program. 18 months later, each department still uses its own risk terminology. No combined risk report reaches the board, and the risk team is consulted only after major decisions are made. How should the firm's approach be characterized? Your options are: A mature enterprise approach that simply needs more time. B, enterprise risk management, since a chief risk officer is now in place. C, still effectively siloed, because a title alone does not create common language or an aggregated view. D, a governance failure caused entirely by the board's refusal to read reports. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is C. Still effectively siloed, because a title alone does not create common language or an aggregated view. C is correct because enterprise status is determined by whether an aggregated view and shared language actually exist across functions, not by an organization chart, separate terminology, no combined reporting, and after-the-fact consultation are all siloed markers that a job title does nothing to remove. This is one of the most commonly tested traps in the domain. A is wrong because time does not convert a structure that lacks common taxonomy and aggregated reporting into one that has them. The missing elements are design choices, not maturity milestones. B is wrong because a title without enterprise-wide aggregation is exactly the appearance of enterprise risk management without the substance. The defining features are the shared measurement and the combined picture. D is wrong because nothing indicates the board refused anything, since no combined report was produced to read. Blaming oversight skips the structural gap that prevented reporting in the first place. A logistics firm hires a chief risk officer, forms a small team, and announces a new enterprise risk management program. 18 months later, Departments still speak different risk languages. No combined report has ever reached the board, and the risk team hears about big decisions only after they're made. A single officer or department doesn't make an approach enterprise-wide. What does is a common taxonomy across functions, a shared measurement scale, aggregated reporting that reaches leadership and the board, and a real connection to decisions while they're still open. The diagnostic questions are unglamorous. Does one report show the combined risk picture? Do the functions use the same words? And is the risk view consulted before a major commitment rather than after? This is the pairing of form and function. Form is the title, the charter, the committee. Function is whether the aggregated view actually exists and reaches decision makers. The two travel together in healthy organizations, which is why form is a fine first clue and a terrible final test. Time and budget don't fix this. Only specific design choices do. When a scenario hands you evidence about function, let it override whatever the form suggests. Question 25. A consultant is asked which idea from the leading international risk management standard provides the underlying argument for managing risk enterprise-wide rather than department by department. Which principle should she cite? Your options are A. Integrated, B. Customized, C. Best available information, D. Continual improvement. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is A. Integrated. A is correct because the integrated principle holds that risk management is not a bolt-on activity, but part of how the organization is governed and run. Applied honestly, that principle rules out treating risk as something each department handles privately in its own corner. Enterprise risk management is what integration looks like once it is put into practice. B is wrong because customized means scaling and tailoring the approach to the organization's own context rather than copying another organization's. A siloed structure could be just as tailored as an integrated one. C is wrong because best available information concerns the quality and limits of the data behind risk decisions. Good data can feed a siloed process without ever crossing department lines. D is wrong because continual improvement means risk management gets better over time through learning and experience. A department could improve steadily while remaining entirely isolated. Of the 8 principles in the international standard, one carries more weight than the rest: integration. It sounds like a platitude, but read carefully, it actually rules out an entire way of organizing risk work. The test is dependency, not effort. A risk function is bolt-on if you could remove it and nothing else about how the organization operates would change, no matter how polished its reports look. The practical test is to look at decision gates. In an integrated organization, a capital approval or product launch has risk input built in as a required step, with a named contributor and a defined question. In a bolt-on organization, risk produces parallel paperwork that runs alongside the decision without touching it. Other ideas crowd nearby without fitting. A siloed structure can be customized. Use the best available information and improve continually, and still fail integration completely. Coordination is close too. It means parts of the organization talk to each other, but integration is stronger. It means risk is embedded in governance and in every major decision. An organization can hold regular cross-functional risk meetings and still commit to major decisions with no risk input at all. That gap is exactly what the integrated principle exists to close. Question 26. During a review, an executive claims the company has a strong risk culture and points to a well-drafted policy manual as evidence. The risk officer explains that the manual is not what the term actually refers to. Which definition should the risk officer give? Your options are A. The set of controls an organization has implemented to reduce likelihood and impact. B. the behavioral norms and attitudes toward risk within an organization. C, the documented list of risks with descriptions and assigned categories. D, the maximum amount of risk the organization will accept in pursuit of its objectives. Take a second, and which answer would you pick? The correct answer is B, the behavioral norms and attitudes toward risk within an organization. B is correct because risk culture is the behavioral norms and attitudes toward risk, which means what people actually do rather than what a document instructs them to do. It shows up in what a loan officer decides when nobody is watching and whether a junior employee believes raising a concern is safe. Because it is informal, it cannot be established by publishing a manual. A is wrong because controls are mechanisms that lower likelihood or impact put in place during the implement step. Culture is what determines whether those controls are respected under pressure. C is wrong because a documented list of risks with categories describes the risk register, an output of identification. It records exposures rather than behavior. D is wrong because the maximum risk an organization will accept in pursuit of objectives is risk appetite, a policy element. Appetite states an intention, while culture determines whether the intention survives contact with daily incentives. Risk culture is the behavioral norms and attitudes toward risk within an organization. It's easy to memorize that definition and still misapply it, because the instinct is to go look for culture in a document. But culture isn't in the documents. It's what a loan officer does when a marginal file crosses the desk. Whether a junior analyst believes raising a problem will be welcomed, and which stories circulate about who gets promoted. Culture is informal, and that's exactly what makes it powerful and hard to manage. Informal norms are learned by watching others, so they spread and persist on their own, and they can't be changed by announcement, because an announcement is formal and the norms travel through a channel it doesn't touch. Exam questions often confuse culture with three neighboring ideas. Controls are mechanisms that lower likelihood or impact. Appetite is a stated boundary on acceptable exposure. Governance is the structures and processes by which the organization is directed and controlled. Culture is what determines whether controls get respected, appetite gets honored, and governance does more than just meet. When policy and behavior diverge, the unspoken rules win every time. Question 27. An employee at a chemical plant notices a developing safety issue but says nothing, because a co-worker who raised a similar concern last year was publicly reprimanded and passed over at review time. Which risk culture indicator is weakest in this organization? Your options are A. Competence and training, B. Consistent application of policy, C. Risk embedded in decision making, D. Open communication and psychological safety. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is D. Open communication and psychological safety. D is correct because psychological safety means employees raise bad news early without fear of blame, and its absence is signaled precisely by silence learned from watching what happened to someone else. Where this indicator is weak, problems get hidden or minimized until they are too large to manage quietly. The employee here understood the real rule regardless of what any policy said. A is wrong because competence concerns whether staff and directors understand basic risk concepts and their own role. The employee recognized the hazard correctly, so knowledge is not the gap. B is wrong because consistent application concerns whether policy applies the same way to top performers as to everyone else. No exception for a star performer appears in the scenario. C is wrong because risk embedded in decisions concerns whether risk is discussed while a decision is being made rather than after. The failure here is upward reporting, not decision sequencing. An employee sees a valve drifting out of specification and says nothing. The reason isn't a mystery. It's a rule the organization already taught once through what happened to someone else. Open communication or psychological safety is the risk culture indicator that governs whether bad news travels upward early. This isn't about comfort or niceness. It's about the expected cost to an individual of surfacing information. When that cost is high, rational people withhold, and fixing the indicator means changing the cost, not exhorting bravery. This failure is damaging because it degrades everything else. Identification depends on people reporting what they see. Measurement depends on honest counts of near misses. And monitoring depends on signals reaching someone who can act. A weak communication culture starves all three at once, and the signal of failure, silence, leaves no artifacts, looking on a dashboard exactly like fewer problems. Distinguishing true safety from hidden suppression requires deliberately looking elsewhere. Exit interview themes, anonymous survey responses, and near misses discovered through other channels that were never officially reported. The indicator most often confused with this is learning orientation, and the distinction is timing. Open communication concerns whether information moves before an event, while learning orientation concerns what the organization does after. They reinforce each other tightly, but a scenario usually makes clear which point in the sequence is in play. Question 28. A brokerage enforces its trade approval policy strictly across most of the sales floor, but its highest producing broker is routinely allowed to skip the second signature. Junior staff notice. Which risk culture indicator is compromised, and what is the practical effect? Your options are A. Consistent application, because quiet exceptions teach everyone what the real rules are. B. Learning orientation, because near misses are no longer investigated for root cause. C. Clear accountability, because no risk owner has been named for trade approval. D. Tone at the top, because executives have not issued a written statement on the policy. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is A. Consistent application, because quiet exceptions teach everyone what the real rules are. A is correct because consistent application means policy applies the same way to the top revenue producer as to everyone else. When an exception is granted quietly and observed widely, the exception becomes the operating norm that staff calibrate against. What the policy says matters far less than what the organization visibly tolerates. B is wrong because learning orientation concerns whether near misses and mistakes are investigated for root cause rather than only for blame. No incident review appears in the scenario. C is wrong because clear accountability concerns whether each risk has a named owner responsible for it. An owner and a process both exist here, and the failure is in enforcement. D is wrong because tone at the top is about the behavior leaders model rather than the statements they publish. Issuing another written statement while the exception continues would change nothing. Let's look at the risk culture indicator behind this question. Consistent application. It asks a simple question. Does policy bind the top revenue producer the same way it binds everyone else? Employees infer the real rule from enforcement, not from the policy text. A rule enforced universally is a rule. A rule enforced selectively is a message about who actually matters, and staff read that message accurately. Picture the control on paper. Every ticket above threshold needs a second signature, checked by the desk supervisor. Now picture the top producer's ticket skipping that step for years, in plain view of junior staff who never stop noticing. There's a structural reason this pattern forms. The people most likely to get exceptions are the ones the firm depends on most, meaning their activity carries the largest exposure. Once the exception runs long enough, revoking it looks like targeting a person rather than restoring policy, so it self-reinforces. The closest neighboring indicator is aligned incentives, which is about what compensation rewards, while consistent application is about whether stated rules are enforced the same for everyone. A firm can have great incentives and still grant exceptions. So diagnosing the scenario means asking whether the flaw sits in the pay plan or in the enforcement. Question 29. After a near miss in which a shipment of mislabeled product was caught just before leaving the warehouse, a distributor convenes a review to trace how the labeling error occurred and what in the process allowed it, rather than to determine who to discipline. Which risk culture indicator does this demonstrate? Your options are A. Aligned incentives, B. Risk appetite calibration, C. Learning orientation, D. Board oversight of management. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is C. Learning orientation. C is correct because A. Learning orientation means near misses and mistakes get investigated for root cause rather than for blame. The practical payoff is that people keep reporting near misses because reporting leads to a fix instead of a punishment. Organizations that reverse this quickly lose visibility into the events that would have warned them. A is wrong because aligned incentives concern whether compensation and recognition reward prudent risk-taking rather than short-term numbers alone. Nothing about pay or recognition appears here. B is wrong because risk appetite calibration concerns setting how much risk the organization will accept in pursuit of objectives. The review is investigating a process failure, not adjusting a threshold. D is wrong because board oversight concerns directors reviewing management's risk process and asking probing questions. This review is being run by management at the operational level. A mislabeled shipment gets caught at the dock minutes before it ships. Nothing reached a customer, no loss occurred anywhere. But what a distributor does next reveals its risk culture. Learning orientation means near misses and mistakes get investigated for root cause, not just assigned blame. The payoff is information nobody else has. A near miss is a free look at a failure path that never had to be paid for. But this only works if the people who discover it choose to report it. If reporting reliably triggers a hunt for who's at fault, the rational response is to stop reporting. The information dries up, and the organization ends up worse off than before, with the same hidden weaknesses and a dashboard falsely suggesting things are improving. Root cause is what separates a real review from a ceremonial one. Asking who mislabeled the pallet finds a person. Asking why the process let the error pass 3 handling points finds a cause worth fixing. But this doesn't erase accountability. Error is a process failure to engineer out, while violation, a deliberate choice, still warrants direct consequence. Learning orientation is easily confused with open communication, since both involve information and both die under blame. The difference is timing. Open communication catches a problem before it becomes an event, while learning orientation examines it after the event has already happened. Question 30. An engineering firm's written policy instructs employees to report schedule risks promptly, but staff privately say that raising a concern just makes you the problem. Management points to the policy as proof the culture is sound. What does the situation demonstrate? Your options are A. That the written policy should be eliminated as unnecessary. B. That culture, not the written policy, determines what people actually do when the two conflict. C. That the measurement step of the risk management process has failed. D. That the firm has satisfied the requirements of the leading international risk standard. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is B. That culture, not the written policy, determines what people actually do when the two conflict. B is correct because a written policy is necessary but not sufficient, and when lived incentives contradict the document, behavior follows the incentives. Organizations that suffered well-publicized risk failures were typically found afterward to have had reasonable-looking policies on paper, What they lacked was a culture that rewarded honesty about risk over hitting a target by any available means. A is wrong because removing the policy would leave the firm inconsistent, undocumented, and fragile the moment leadership changed. Policy and culture reinforce each other, and neither substitutes for the other. C is wrong because measurement is the assessment of likelihood and impact for identified risks. The breakdown here occurs before that at whether risks get surfaced at all. D is wrong because satisfying a standard means integrating risk management into how the organization is actually governed and run. A policy that staff root around demonstrates the opposite. The biggest risk failures of the last 20 years all had one thing in common: reasonable-looking policies, omissions, scandals, fake account scandals, different industries entirely, and yet investigators found solid documentation in every case. The paperwork wasn't the problem. The core relationship is this: a written policy is necessary but not sufficient. It's necessary because without it there's no standard to train against or audit against, but it's not sufficient because a document can't enforce itself. That depends entirely on the environment around it. Policy without a real supporting culture becomes something people quietly route around. Culture without policy is fragile and undocumented, disappearing the moment the people who modeled it leave. The strongest organizations hold both, and each one keeps the other honest. There's a simple test for alignment. Compare what the policy asks for against what the compensation plan actually pays for. If the policy says report concerns that slow a deal, but pay rewards closed deals with no quality offset, the organization has told employees which one to believe. Structure, policies, committees, reporting lines is easy to see from the outside. Culture only reveals itself through behavior when a quarter is closing and pressure is on, which is exactly what these scandals showed at scale. Question 31. A credit union's leadership wants to strengthen its risk culture. Before changing anything, it runs anonymous staff surveys, interviews branch managers across 3 regions, pulls 2 years of incident and near-miss history, and reviews how loan officers are compensated. Which step of the 5-step culture building model does this work represent? Your options are: A. Step 5, communicate the vision. B. Step 3, gap analysis. C. Step 4, build the action plan. D. Step 1, assess the current state. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is D. Step 1, assess the current state. D is correct because Step 1 produces an honest, evidence-based picture of where things actually stand rather than the flattering version people offer in hallway conversation. Surveys, interviews, incident history, and a compensation review are the standard tools for building that baseline. Note that the scenario never uses the word assess, which is typical of how this distinction gets tested. A is wrong because communicating the vision is repeated messaging and visible follow-through after a plan exists. Nothing has been decided yet at this stage. B is wrong because gap analysis compares assessment findings against a stated desired state and diagnoses why the differences exist. The desired state has not been defined, so there is nothing yet to compare against. C is wrong because building the plan converts diagnosed gaps into specific initiatives with named owners and deadlines. No gaps have been diagnosed at this point in the sequence. Changing culture deliberately starts with a 5-step model, and everything hinges on step 1, assessing the current state. Skip it or fake it, and every later step aims at a target that was never actually located. Impressions almost always look better than reality because people tell executives what's comfortable to hear. An assessment built on hallway chats and self-report just confirms what the organization already believed, which is the least useful outcome possible. Real evidence comes from specific tools, employee surveys and interviews at every level, a review of what leadership meetings actually discuss versus skip, a review of compensation plans, near miss and loss history and ethics line data, where even low volume is itself a finding. Compensation plans are the most revealing tool and the most often skipped, because pay plans state exactly what behavior gets rewarded in numbers. Where the pay plan and the stated policy disagree, the assessment has found something real, without anyone needing to admit anything. This is why assessment is so often confused with gap analysis. Assessment just establishes what's true now, with no interpretation attached, and that's what makes it useful. The comparing and diagnosing come later, once the evidence is actually in hand. Question 32. Following its assessment, a credit union's leadership works with the board to write out specific target behaviors. Loan officers flag marginal quality files without fear of penalty. Risk appears as a standing item at every leadership meeting, and compensation rewards loan quality alongside volume. Which step does this represent? Your options are A. Step 1. Assess the current state. B. Step 4. Build the action plan. C. Step 2. Define the desired future state. D. Step 5. Communicate the vision. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is C. Step 2. Define the desired future state. C is correct because Step 2 is where leadership states specifically what target behavior should look like, tied to strategy and to the organization's risk appetite. The value is in the concreteness, because vague aspirations like being more risk aware do not survive contact with daily operations. These statements become the benchmark the next step measures current practice against. A is wrong because assessment gathers evidence about how things currently work through surveys, interviews, and history. This scenario describes the target rather than the baseline. B is wrong because building the plan attaches owners and deadlines to specific initiatives that close diagnosed gaps. No initiatives or owners appear here. D is wrong because communicating the vision is the delivery of these expectations through repeated messaging and reinforcement. Writing the statements comes before broadcasting them. Be more risk aware sounds like a goal, but it's really a slogan. Nobody can tell whether any action moves you toward it. And that's exactly the failure Step 2 of the culture model is built to prevent. Step 2 requires leadership with board input to state the target behavior. It must describe behavior people actually do, not attitudes they hold. And it must connect to strategy and risk appetite rather than generic good practice. Compare the vague version to the specific one. Loan officers flag marginal quality files without fear of penalty. Risk becomes a standing item at every leadership meeting, and compensation rewards loan quality alongside volume. Each one observable, each one checkable. Board input turns a management preference into an organizational expectation. Since directors hold ultimate oversight of enterprise risk, the desired state is defined after the current state is assessed, so the target is realistic and grounded. And Step 2 only names the destination. Step 4 assigns owners and deadlines to build the route. Question 33. A credit union compares its survey findings against its stated target behaviors and works out why each difference exists. The pay plan is designed around volume alone. Branch managers fear how an escalation will look to the regional vice president, and no formal expectation requires risk on the leadership agenda. What is the purpose of this activity? Your options are A. To diagnose the root causes of gaps so that the eventual plan fixes causes rather than symptoms. B. To assign accountability for each identified risk to a named owner. C. To determine how much risk the organization is willing to accept in pursuit of its objectives. D. To broadcast the new expectations across multiple communication channels. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is A. To diagnose the root causes of gaps so that the eventual plan fixes causes rather than symptoms. A is correct because gap analysis lines up the current state findings against the desired state statements and asks why each gap exists. The diagnosis matters because a fix aimed at a symptom leaves the underlying driver untouched and the behavior returns. Notice that the three causes named are genuinely different in kind, which means they will require different remedies. B is wrong because assigning a named owner to a risk is the ownership step of the 6-step risk management process. That is a different model addressing individual risks rather than culture. C is wrong because determining how much risk the organization will accept describes setting risk appetite, a policy matter. Appetite informs the desired state but is not what gap analysis produces. D is wrong because broadcasting expectations across channels is the communication step, which comes after a plan exists. Diagnosis precedes both planning and messaging. Gap analysis either makes a culture initiative useful or turns it into an expensive way of restating the obvious. Lining up the assessment against the desired state is the easy part. The step that actually carries value is asking why each gap exists, and it's the step most organizations skip. A credit union finds branch managers suppressing marginal loan flags and responds by writing a policy requiring the flags. That fixes the symptom precisely and changes nothing, because managers stopped flagging out of fear of the regional VP's reaction, not because a rule was missing. The behavior returns because the real driver was never touched. Consider 3 findings from one assessment. The pay plan rewards volume only, which is a compensation design problem, not a values problem. Branch managers suppress flags out of fear rooted in how escalations are received. And risk never appears on the leadership agenda, an absence of formal expectation. 3 gaps, 3 causes, and a single generic initiative aimed at all 3 would fix none of them. Don't confuse gap analysis with the 6-step risk process just because both involve diagnosis. Gap analysis belongs to culture building and examines the distance between current and desired behavior. The 6-step process handles individual risks, moving through identification, measurement, ownership, response, implementation, and monitoring. They share vocabulary and almost nothing else. Root causes often sit in decisions leadership made, which makes honest diagnosis politically uncomfortable. An organization that always locates gaps in employee attitudes and never in incentive design or meeting agendas is producing diagnoses shaped by what's safe to say, not what's true. Question 34. Having diagnosed why its culture gaps exist, a credit union assigns each fix an owner and a due date, revise the incentive plan to add a loan quality metric by the 2nd quarter, train regional vice presidents on receiving escalations without punishing the messenger by the 3rd quarter, and add a standing risk item to leadership agendas immediately. Which step is this? Your options are A. Step 2, define the desired future state. B. Step 4, build the action plan. C. Step 3, gap analysis. D. Step 5, communicate the vision. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is B. Step 4, build the action plan. B is correct because Step 4 turns each diagnosed gap into a specific initiative with a named owner and a deadline. The tell is the pairing of accountability with a date, which is what separates a plan from a wish. Each initiative here also maps to a distinct root cause rather than to the surface symptom. A is wrong because defining the desired state describes what target behavior should look like, without yet specifying who will build it or when. The commitments and dates here go well past that. C is wrong because gap analysis diagnoses why current practice differs from the target. That diagnosis has already been completed before these assignments were made. D is wrong because communicating the vision delivers the new expectations repeatedly and reinforces them through what leadership rewards. Assigning owners and deadlines is internal planning work. Step 4 turns each diagnosed gap into a specific initiative with a named owner and a deadline. These two attachments aren't decoration, they're what make the plan real. A named owner converts a shared intention into a personal one, since an initiative belonging to everyone belongs to nobody. A deadline converts an indefinite commitment into a checkable one. Initiatives without dates reliably lose to initiatives with them. Notice each initiative traces to a specific root cause from gap analysis, not a symptom. The pay plan revision addresses compensation design. The escalation training addresses how vice presidents receive bad news. And the standing agenda item addresses an absent formal expectation. None of this is a vague culture initiative. Plans like this usually fail in the gap between assignment and authority. Naming an owner who lacks the ability to make the change produces an initiative that misses its deadline for reasons nobody saw coming. So checking that each owner truly controls their mechanism prevents a common failure. Sequencing matters too. Changes to what people believe the organization rewards, like pay plan revisions, shift behavior faster than training does. And remember, function determines classification. The same policy update is planning work with an owner and date, but communication work when it's just one channel repeating the message. Question 35. A manufacturer's leadership announces new risk culture expectations in a single all-staff email, then considers the culture change effort finished. 6 months later, behavior on the floor is unchanged. What does the 5-step model say was missing? Your options are A formal risk register listing each cultural weakness as a separate entry. B. An external audit of the announcement before it was distributed. C. Repetition across multiple channels plus consistent follow-through in what leadership actually rewards and tolerates. D. Nothing, since a single clear communication satisfies the requirements of the model. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is C. Repetition across multiple channels plus consistent follow-through in what leadership actually rewards and tolerates. C is correct because a single memo does not change culture, because employees calibrate against what actually gets rewarded and tolerated afterward, rather than against announcements. The communication step requires town halls, revised policy text, onboarding material, and performance review criteria working together, backed by visible follow-through. The step is also not a finish line since culture drifts and mature organizations cycle back to reassess. A is wrong because a risk register logs identified risk with descriptions and categories as part of the 6-step process. Cultural weaknesses are addressed through the 5-step model rather than by register entries. B is wrong because no audit requirement attaches to internal communications in this model. Auditing the wording would not have changed what leadership rewarded afterward. D is wrong because treating one announcement as sufficient is precisely the failure described. Behavior follows sustained reinforcement, not a single message. One email announcing new risk culture expectations, followed by leadership calling it done, is one of the most reliably ineffective interventions in management. 6 months later, nothing has changed, even though the message was clear, accurate, and sent to everyone. Clarity was never the constraint. The 5th step requires leadership to repeat the new expectation across multiple channels: town halls, revised policy text, onboarding material, and performance review criteria. A single message competes with everything else in an inbox and loses. But an expectation appearing everywhere starts to look like how the organization actually operates. The more important half of this step is what happens after the messaging. Leadership demonstrates the expectation through what actually gets rewarded and tolerated. The first time a manager escalates a marginal deal, everyone watches the outcome. And that single moment carries more weight than the entire communication campaign. This asymmetry explains why culture change so often stalls. Consistent follow-through builds credibility slowly over many observed instances, but a single contradiction destroys it quickly, because people update faster toward the cynical reading. Step 5 is not a finish line. Culture drifts as people turn over and pressures change. So mature organizations cycle back to step 1 and reassess, treating the model as an ongoing loop rather than a project with a completion date. Question 36. A regional bank's board spends most of its meeting time approving individual loan files and reviewing single transactions, while management's enterprise risk report sits undiscussed at the back of the packet. What does this best illustrate? Your options are: A. The monitoring step of the 6-step risk management process working as designed. B. An appropriately conservative interpretation of directors' fiduciary duty. C. A well-functioning ERM policy in action. D. Confusion between the board's oversight role and management's operating role. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is D. Confusion between the board's oversight role and management's operating role. D is correct because directors hold ultimate oversight responsibility for enterprise risk management, while executives and staff manage the business and manage risk day to day. Approving individual transactions is operating work, and time spent on it is time not spent probing the aggregated picture. A board doing management's job is a recurring signal in exam scenarios that an answer choice is wrong. A is wrong because monitoring is the ongoing tracking of specific risks and their responses after treatment. Reviewing transactions is not monitoring in the process sense. B is wrong because fiduciary duty is discharged through informed oversight, not by substituting directors for management. Reviewing individual files while ignoring enterprise exposure makes oversight weaker rather than more careful. C is wrong because an ERM policy establishes appetite, roles, and responsibilities, the process to follow, and escalation requirements. A functioning policy would define the board's role as oversight and be visibly followed. A regional bank's board spends 2 hours approving individual loan files and only 20 minutes on committee reports, while management's enterprise risk report is received without any discussion at all. Nothing improper happened procedurally, yet the board is doing the wrong job. Directors, as those charged with governance, hold ultimate responsibility for overseeing enterprise risk, but oversight and management are different jobs. Executives and staff manage the business and manage risk day to day. So when the board approves individual loan files, it has stepped down a level, leaving no time for the aggregated picture only the board can interrogate. Reviewing transactions feels diligent and produces a comfortable illusion of control, because the items are concrete and the judgments are clear. Enterprise exposure is abstract and harder to reason about, so boards naturally drift toward the work that feels productive rather than the work the role actually requires. A board immersed in transactions loses independence from management's framing, because it is now participating in the same decisions it is supposed to evaluate. A director who approved the lease cannot easily probe whether the lease approval process itself is producing good outcomes. Exam stems flag boards approving individual contracts, running investigations, or reviewing single transactions as a signal against sound governance. Hold the pairing precisely. Management makes and executes decisions, while oversight evaluates whether the process is sound, exposure fits appetite, and information reaching the board is adequate. Question 37. Before joining a hospital system's key oversight committees, incoming directors complete dedicated training on the organization's clinical operations, service lines, and risk landscape. What does this practice best illustrate? Your options are: A. The ownership step of the 6-step risk management process. B. Governance equipping directors to provide meaningful oversight. C. A transfer response applied to reputational risk. D. A siloed approach to managing board-level risk. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is B. Governance equipping directors to provide meaningful oversight. B is correct because directors have to understand the business well enough to ask hard questions, which is why the material stresses training aims specifically at identifying risk. Board membership is an active oversight role rather than a passive credential. Equipping directors with real fluency in operations is governance investing in its own capacity to oversee. A is wrong because the ownership step assigns a named person or function accountability for a specific risk on the register. Board training is not the assignment of a risk owner. C is wrong because transfer shifts the financial consequence of a risk to a third party through insurance or contract terms. Training shifts nothing financially. D is wrong because a siloed approach means departments manage risk independently with no shared view. Board education is enterprise level work by definition. Board membership is not a passive credential. Many governance failures trace back to directors who attended every meeting but lacked the business understanding needed to ask a hard question. Oversight is mechanical, not aspirational. It requires knowing enough about the business to recognize when a number is implausible, a category is missing, or an assumption is doing more work than the evidence supports. Without that fluency, a director can only accept what is presented, turning oversight into ratification. Consider a hospital system where incoming directors train on clinical operations, service line structure, payer mix, regulatory exposure, and the organization's risk landscape before joining committees. A trained director hears a quality report and knows which measures matter. An untrained one can only agree. Management frames what the board sees, reasonably but inevitably selectively. So the board's value lies in understanding that framing does not supply. That's why training extends beyond formal onboarding to site visits, meetings with second-line management without the chief executive present, external briefings, and periodic education on emerging exposures. This differs from risk culture training, which is about whether staff and directors alike grasp basic risk concepts and their roles. When a scenario centers on directors and oversight committees, it's pointing at governance. When it centers on employees generally, it's pointing at culture. Question 38. Executives at a construction company consistently model careful risk behavior and speak about it at company meetings, but site supervisors quietly tell crews to work around the reporting process when a job is running behind. Frontline behavior never changes. What best explains the breakdown? Your options are: A. Tone at the top failed to become tone in the middle, so the message died in the org chart. B. The company lacks a risk register and therefore cannot track safety exposures. C. The board improperly delegated its oversight responsibility to management. D. Risk appetite was set too low relative to the company's objectives. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is A. Tone at the top failed to become tone in the middle, so the message died in the org chart. A is correct because employees calibrate their risk behavior by watching what leaders actually reward and tolerate, and supervisors are the leaders they see every day. Tone at the top is necessary but insufficient on its own, because it has to be carried through the middle and lived at the front line. Where middle management contradicts the executive message, the middle wins. B is wrong because A register logs identified risks with descriptions and categories. Its absence would hamper tracking, but would not explain supervisors actively undercutting a process that exists. C is wrong because delegating day-to-day risk management to executives and staff is correct practice, since the board oversees rather than manages. Nothing improper about delegation appears here. D is wrong because risk appetite states how much risk the organization will accept in pursuit of objectives. The problem is that a stated expectation is being ignored, not that a threshold was miscalibrated. Executives can say all the right things about safety and risk, and still watch frontline behavior stay exactly the same for years. To understand why, we need to trace tone as it travels down the org chart. Tone at the top is necessary, but not sufficient because most employees don't watch executives. They watch their supervisor, their manager, their team lead. Tone at the top has to become tone in the middle, and then tone at the front line, or the message simply dies in the org chart. Middle management is the structural pinch point, a supervisor evaluated on schedule adherence, hearing a safety message from a podium, will rationally favor whatever determines their performance review, not the message. This is the same pattern seen with loan officers who stopped flagging marginal files, not because executive intent was wrong, but because one layer converted a stated expectation into its opposite. Communication is about the channels repeating a message. Tone is about what leaders at every level actually model and tolerate. And no communication program survives a supervisor who contradicts it. Question 39. A newly formed nonprofit is deciding where ultimate oversight responsibility for its enterprise risk management program should sit. Based on the governance principles in this domain, where does it belong? Your options are A. With the internal audit function, which tests controls independently. B. With the Chief Financial Officer who controls the budget for risk activity. C. With each department head for the risk arising in that department. D. With the Board of Directors, distinct from management's day-to-day management of risk. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is D. With the Board of Directors, distinct from management's day-to-day management of risk. D is correct because directors, as those charged with governance, hold ultimate oversight responsibility for enterprise risk management. Oversight and management are different jobs. The board oversees while executives and staff run the business and manage risk daily. Governance is also where the expectation for a risk-aware culture gets set and formally sanctioned. A is wrong because internal audit provides independent testing of whether controls and policies are working as intended. It is a source of assurance to the board rather than the holder of ultimate oversight. B is wrong because a Chief Financial Officer is a member of management and reports to the board. Budget authority over risk activity is not the same as oversight responsibility for the program. C is wrong because department heads own the risks in their areas, which is appropriate and unchanged under an enterprise approach. Distributed ownership does not create the enterprise-level oversight the board provides. A newly formed nonprofit must decide where ultimate oversight of risk management sits, and the obvious candidates are all wrong. The CFO controls the budget, internal audit test controls, and department heads own their local risks, but none of them holds ultimate responsibility. The word ultimate means accountability terminates at the board and cannot be delegated away. Even though the board rightly hands execution to management, activity can spread freely through the organization, but accountability always concentrates upward and stops there. Internal audit gives independent assurance and reports to the board precisely to stay independent of management. The CFO holds budget authority as management, and department heads own individual risks, all legitimate roles, none of them the overseer. Picture the board standing above the organization rather than inside it, since it is ultimately accountable for direction itself. Because risk management is really about whether objectives are achievable, that question is inseparable from direction, and therefore inseparable from the board's core function. Confusing activity with accountability produces boards that either meddle in operations or wrongly treat delegation as an exit from responsibility. The exam expects one answer. The board holds ultimate oversight distinct from day-to-day management. Question 40. A university committee is drafting its charter and needs a working definition of governance to open the document. Which definition matches the one used in this domain? Your options are A. The set of controls implemented to reduce the likelihood or impact of identified risks. B. The behavioral norms and attitudes toward risk within an organization. C. The structures and processes by which an organization is directed and controlled. D. The running log of identified risks, their descriptions and their categories. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is C. The structures and processes by which an organization is directed and controlled. C is correct because governance is the structures and processes by which an organization is directed and controlled, which is deliberately broader than any single committee or document. That breadth is what lets governance encompass the board, the committee structure, the policies those bodies approve, and the reporting that flows back upward. It is the machinery through which expectations become enforceable. A is wrong because controls are mechanisms that lower likelihood or impact and are built during the implement step. They operate inside the structure that governance establishes. B is wrong because behavioral norms and attitudes toward risk define risk culture. Culture and governance reinforce each other, but they are separate ideas and only one of them is formal. D is wrong because a running log of identified risks with descriptions and categories describes the risk register. That is an operational artifact rather than a governance definition. Governance is the structures and processes by which an organization is directed and controlled. That definition is deliberately broad. Governance is not a single body or document, but the whole apparatus that sets direction and enforces adherence. Directed means setting the course, strategy, objectives, and risk appetite. Controlled means ensuring that course is followed, reporting, escalation, and consequence. A company can have one without the other, and either gap produces a recognizable kind of failure. Structures include the board, committees, and reporting lines. Processes include how decisions get approved, how information travels, and how policies get made and reviewed. A missing committee is a structural gap. A committee that never gets the right information is a process gap. Governance is the origin point for formal risk expectations. It creates the ERM policy, not the other way around. Culture runs alongside informal and immediate, keeping the policy honest by determining whether anyone follows it when no one is watching. The line to God is governance versus management. The board oversees, executives manage, and that line is drawn by function, not seniority. Question 41. A utility company is drafting its first ERM policy and asks which content belongs in the document. Which of the following would most likely appear in a well-designed ERM policy? Your options are A. The exact bonus figure approved for each named executive. B. The organization's risk appetite statement along with escalation and reporting requirements. C. The complete customer account list maintained by the billing system. D. The coming year's marketing campaign calendar. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is B. The organization's risk appetite statement along with escalation and reporting requirements. B is correct because an ERM policy is a formal governance document establishing risk management expectations, and appetite plus escalation sit at its center. A typical policy also covers purpose and scope, roles and responsibilities for the board, management, the risk function, and staff, the risk management process to follow, and a review cycle for the policy itself. Everything in it answers how risk decisions get made and reported. A is wrong because individual executive compensation figures belong to compensation committee records, rather than a risk governance document. Incentive design influences risk culture, but the specific numbers are not policy content. C is wrong because a customer list is operating data with no bearing on how risk expectations are set. Including it would create a confidentiality problem and serve no governance purpose. D is wrong because a marketing calendar is an operational plan. The policy would govern how risks to that plan are managed without containing the plan itself. Before drafting an ERM policy, an organization has to know what actually belongs inside it. The answer comes from purpose. This is a governance document that establishes how risk decisions get made by whom and how they get reported. A typical policy runs through 6 sections: purpose and scope, the risk appetite statement, roles and responsibilities, the risk management process, escalation and reporting, and the review cycle. 2 of these carry outsized operational weight: appetite, which turns risk decisions into a stated organizational boundary rather than personal temperament, and escalation, which ensures a crossed boundary is actually discovered and acted on. The role section is where this matters most. It puts in writing that the board oversees while management manages. That written line gives directors something to point to when tempted to step into operations, and gives management something to point to when the board drifts toward reviewing transactions. Exam stems test this by mixing in things that don't belong, like compensation figures, customer list, or specific business plans, since those are things the organization possesses rather than expectations it sets. And they separate the policy from its neighbors. The policy governs the rules, the register lists the specific risks, and the map displays them by likelihood and impact. Whenever a question asks which document formalizes appetite, roles, process, and escalation together, it's pointing at the policy. Kisa waito as. Nothing else in this domain covers that full combination. Question 42. A newly appointed board member questions why the organization should formalize its risk expectations into a written policy when leadership already talks about risk regularly and the culture seems healthy. Which reasoning best answers the question? Your options are: A policy survives leadership turnover, scales consistently to new hires, and gives internal audit a concrete standard to test against. B, a policy eliminates the need for a risk-aware culture by making behavior mandatory. C, a policy converts risk from a two-sided concept into a purely downside concept for reporting purposes. D, a policy relieves the board of oversight responsibility by transferring it to management. Take a second, and which answer would you pick? The correct answer is A. A policy survives leadership turnover, scales consistently to new hires, and gives internal audit a concrete standard to test against. A is correct because culture without policy is inconsistent, undocumented, and fragile the moment leadership changes. Formalizing the expectation preserves it through turnover, delivers it identically to every new hire, and creates something auditable. Governance creates the policy, and the policy is what turns the process and its responsibilities into something the organization can be held to. B is wrong because policy cannot substitute for culture, and a document that people quietly route around becomes a check-the-box exercise. When incentives and unspoken norms conflict with the written text, the norms tend to win. C is wrong because formal risk management treats risk as two-sided, with effects that can be positive, negative, or both. A policy would preserve that framing rather than narrow it. D is wrong because ultimate oversight responsibility for enterprise risk management stays with the board regardless of what any document says. A policy clarifies roles rather than transferring accountability away from directors. A new board member asks a fair question. If the culture is already healthy, why bother writing a formal risk policy? The answer reveals exactly what a written policy is for. A written policy has 3 properties that culture alone can't deliver: It survives leadership turnover, it scales consistently to new hires, and it gives internal audit a concrete standard to test against. The turnover point matters most because informal norms depend entirely on the people modeling them. When the executive who rewarded early escalation leaves, the norm can leave too unless it was written down. Organizations often discover their culture was personal, not institutional, right when it's too late to fix. Writing a policy also forces decisions that culture had left comfortably vague. The exact escalation threshold, who owns risk in a shared process, and how much risk is actually acceptable. Shared intuitions diverge more than expected once someone has to write a number down. The policy alone can't carry the load either. A document people quietly ignore becomes just paperwork. Governance creates the policy, but whether anyone is actually held to it remains a cultural matter. Question 43. A consultant is asked to explain the relationship between an organization's ERM policy and its risk culture. Which statement captures the relationship most accurately? Your options are: A strong culture makes the policy unnecessary since behavior already meets the standard. B, the policy determines the culture because employees adopt whatever behavior is documented. C, each keeps the other honest. The policy gives culture a documented standard to be measured against, and culture determines whether anyone follows the policy unobserved. D, they are unrelated since policy is a governance concern and culture is a human resources concern. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is C. Each keeps the other honest. The policy gives culture a documented standard to be measured against, and culture determines whether anyone follows the policy unobserved. C is correct because the relationship runs in both directions, and the strongest organizations invest in both. Policy without a supporting culture becomes a check-the-box exercise people root around, which is the pattern found after well-publicized risk failures where the paperwork looked fine. Culture without policy is inconsistent and fragile the moment leadership changes. I is wrong because a healthy culture today offers no protection against drift, turnover, or growth. The documented standard is what makes the expectation durable and testable. B is wrong because documentation alone does not change behavior, which is the central lesson of the policy versus culture material. Employees calibrate against incentives and what leadership visibly tolerates. D is wrong because governance is precisely where the expectation for a risk-aware culture gets set and formally sanctioned. Separating the two misses how each reinforces the other. Policy and culture can fail in two very different ways, and telling them apart determines the entire remedy. Policy without culture becomes a check-the-box exercise, because a document cannot enforce itself when incentives push the other way. Culture without policy fails more quietly, running well until leadership changes, headcount doubles, or a new site opens with nobody who absorbed the original norms. The strongest organizations hold both, because each keeps the other honest. Policy gives culture a documented standard to be measured against, while culture determines whether anyone follows the policy when no one is watching. The practical diagnostic is to examine the policy and the behavior separately, rather than assuming one reflects the other. Ask whether the policy sets real thresholds. Then watch what happens under pressure and what the pay plan rewards. Where the two disagree, the behavior is the accurate account of the organization. A polished policy and a clean reporting line are easy to inspect from outside, but they can coexist with an organization that behaves badly when it matters. Culture is only visible through behavior under pressure, and that makes it the better predictor of outcomes. Question 44. A project team has identified a supply disruption risk and rated it high likelihood with medium impact. According to the 6-step risk management process, which step comes next? Your options are: A. Implement the chosen control and retrain affected staff. B. Monitor the risk for changes in likelihood over the coming quarter. C. Select among avoiding, reducing, transferring, and accepting the risk. D. Assign a named person or function accountable for the risk. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is D. Assign a named person or function accountable for the risk. Or D is correct because the 6 steps run: identify, measure, own, address, implement, monitor. So ownership follows measurement. Assigning accountability before choosing a response matters because the owner is the person who drives that decision and follows it through. Skip this step and everyone's responsibility quietly becomes nobody's responsibility. A is wrong because implementation is the 5th step and cannot happen before a response has been selected. There is nothing yet to build or retrain against. B is wrong because monitoring is the 6th step and tracks whether a risk and its chosen response behave as expected. No response exists yet to track. C is wrong because selecting among the 4 response options is the address step which comes fourth. It follows ownership rather than preceding it. Identify, measure, own, address, implement, monitor. 6 steps in that exact order because each step depends on the output of the one before it. And organizations that skip or reorder them produce failures that trace back to exactly where the sequence broke. Nothing can be measured until it's identified. No owner can be assigned until severity is known, since severity determines who the right owner is. And no response, implementation, or monitoring can happen without an owner to drive it. The surprising placement is own at step 3 before addressing the risk. Assigning ownership first means the response decision is made by the person who will actually answer for it, rather than by whoever happened to be in the meeting. This is why the boundary between measure and own matters so much. Measurement produces a severity rating, which determines how senior the owner needs to be. Assign a severe risk to a junior owner without authority, and the failure was predictable. This sequence parallels the international standard's own process under different names. The exam expects fluency in both vocabularies and expects you to spot exactly which step was skipped when a described outcome is missing a rating, an owner, or an implementation. Question 45. A hospitality group runs a structured workshop, brainstorms with department leaders, reviews 3 years of incident history, and conducts a scan across social, technological, economic, environmental, and political factors. Each exposure surfaced is logged with a description and a category. Which step of the 6-step process is this, and what does it produce? Your options are A. Measure, producing a risk map. B. Identify, producing a risk register. C. Own, producing an accountability matrix. D. Address, producing a treatment plan. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is B. Identify, producing a risk register. B is correct because identification finds and describes the risks that could affect objectives using brainstorming workshops, checklists, interviews, loss history, and environmental scans such as STEEP. The scan across social, technological, economic, environmental, and political factors prompts a broader search than simply asking what went wrong last time. The output is the risk register, a running log of each identified risk with its description and category. A is wrong because measurement assesses likelihood and impact for risks already on the register and often plots them on a risk map. No ratings have been assigned in this scenario. C is wrong because ownership assigns a named person or function accountable for tracking a risk and following through on its response. Nothing about accountability appears here. D is wrong because the address step decides the response strategy among avoiding, reducing, transferring, and accepting. Response selection comes well after identification. Most risk identification quietly drifts towards the past, because loss history is concrete and easy to point to. But the risks that hurt organizations most are often the ones that haven't happened yet. STEEP forces a wider search by scanning social, technological, economic, environmental, and political factors, asking what's changing and what it could mean for the organization's objectives. This surfaces emerging exposures that no incident log would ever produce. Checklists, loss history, workshops, and interviews each catch some risks and miss others. Checklists are thorough within their scope but blind outside it. Loss history is accurate about repeats but silent about novel threats. And workshops only surface what the room happens to know. Competent programs combine tools to compensate for these blind spots. A risk register entry that just says supply chain concerns cannot be rated, because nobody can estimate the likelihood or impact of a vague concern. Naming an actual event, like a single source supplier failing and delaying a launch, is what makes measurement possible later. Identification means noting a risk exists, describing it, and filing it under a category in a live running register. Measuring its likelihood and impact is a separate act that comes later, and telling the two apart is often the whole exam question. Question for tags. A bank's risk committee formally decides to reduce wire fraud risk by requiring a second authorized signature on transfers above a set threshold. 2 months later, the workflow has not been reconfigured. No staff have been retrained, and transfers are still processing on a single approval. Which step of the 6-step process has not occurred? Your options are: A. Implement, B. Measure, C. Own, D. Identify. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is A. Implement. This is correct because implementation is where the chosen response becomes operating reality, building the control, buying the policy, retraining staff, changing the process, or adding the contract clause. A response that is decided but never executed protects nobody, which is exactly the situation described. The decision and the execution are separate steps for this reason. B is wrong because measurement assesses likelihood and impact, and the committee clearly knew enough about the exposure to select a response. Assessment is not what stalled. C is wrong because ownership assigns accountability for a risk, and a risk committee formally deciding a response indicates the risk was owned. The gap opens after the decision. D is wrong because identification finds and describes risks that could affect objectives. Wire fraud was plainly identified since a specific response was chosen for it. A risk committee decided that large transfers need a second signature. 2 months later, nothing has changed operationally. The decision was never wrong, it simply never became real. Before the decision, the organization knew the risk was unmanaged. After the decision, but before implementation, the register reads as though it's handled, so attention moves on. Documentation says one thing, reality says another, and that's exactly when people stop checking. A handful of causes explain most failures here. The response was chosen without consulting whoever had to build it. No owner was attached to implementation specifically, no date was set, or the change quietly lost out to revenue projects competing for the same technical resources. Keep the pairing sharp, address selects among avoiding, reducing, transferring, and accepting a risk. Implement is what actually carries out that selection, configuring systems, retraining people, changing the process. A control configured with the wrong threshold has been implemented in the sense that work happened, but not in the sense that anything is protected. A risk can be identified, measured, owned, and addressed perfectly, and still cause the exact loss it was meant to prevent, because the sequence stopped one step short of doing anything. Question 47. A logistics firm's register lists a pending regulation with a clear description, a category, and a rating of high likelihood and medium impact. Months later, the regulation takes effect and nothing has been done about it. In interviews, 3 managers each say they assumed another department was handling it, which step was skipped. Your options are identify, B, measure, C, monitor, D, own. Don't overthink it, which one feels right? The correct answer is D, own. D is correct because ownership assigns a specific person or function accountability for tracking a risk and following through on its response. Without a named owner, the risk had nobody to move it to a response decision or an implementation, which is why it simply sat. The interview answers are the classic symptom, since everyone's responsibility becomes nobody's responsibility in practice. A is wrong because identification was completed. Because the regulation is described and categorized on the register, the exposure was known. B is wrong because measurement was completed because likelihood and impact were both rated. The assessment existed and went unused. C is wrong because monitoring tracks whether a risk and its chosen response behave as expected over time. No response was ever selected, so the breakdown occurs earlier in the sequence. A risk sat on the register for 11 months, fully described, categorized, and rated high likelihood, medium impact. Operations assumed compliance was tracking it. Compliance assumed legal was tracking it. Legal assumed the business unit was tracking it. Everyone knew about it, nobody owned it. A true owner is a named person, not a department or a committee, since collective accountability just distributes until it disappears. That ownership carries 3 things: accountability, meaning they answer for the risk; authority, meaning they can actually cause a response; and information, meaning they know when conditions change. Assign the first without the other 2, and you get someone blamed for outcomes they never controlled. The pair most often confused is ownership against address. Ownership assigns an accountable person to the risk. Address decides what to actually do about it. A risk can have a clear, competent owner and still sit entirely unaddressed, and that is a different failure calling for a different conversation. Exam stems reach this step through a risk that was identified and rated but never advanced, often with people explicitly assuming someone else had it. That points to a failure of ownership. Missing ratings point somewhere else, to measurement, and a response chosen but never built points to implementation. This is why clear accountability shows up as a hallmark of strong risk culture. A named owner for every risk defeats the everyone's responsibility trap before it can even start. Question 48. A study group is reviewing the 4 risk response options and disagrees about definitions. Which pairing is correct? Your options are: A, avoid means shifting the financial consequence of a risk to an insurer. B, accept means lowering the likelihood of a risk through a new control. C, transfer means shifting the financial consequence of a risk to a third party. D, reduce means stopping the activity that creates the risk entirely. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is C. Transfer means shifting the financial consequence of a risk to a third party. C is correct because transfer moves the financial consequence to another party, most commonly through insurance or a contractual indemnification clause with a vendor. Note what transfer does not do, which is remove the risk itself. The event can still occur, and the operational and reputational consequences typically stay with the organization even when the money moves. A is wrong because stopping the activity that creates a risk entirely is avoidance, such as exiting a product line with an unresolvable safety problem. Involving an insurer describes transfer instead. B is wrong because taking no special action because a risk sits within appetite is acceptance. Adding a control to lower likelihood describes reduction. D is wrong because lowering likelihood or impact through controls is reduction. such as requiring a second sign-off on large wire transfers. Ceasing the activity outright is avoidance. Once a risk is measured and owned, 4 responses exist, and they're co-equal rather than ranked. Most real answers actually combine 2 or more of them. Avoid stops the activity that creates the risk. Reduce or mitigate lowers likelihood or impact through controls. Transfer shifts the financial consequence to a third party. Accept or retain takes no special action because the exposure already sits within appetite. Transfer is the most misunderstood response. Buying insurance moves who writes the check afterward, but the warehouse can still burn and customers still go unserved. Treating an insured exposure as a managed one confuses financing with control. So the real distinction is what each response changes. Avoid removes the exposure entirely. Reduce lowers its likelihood or impact. Transfer changes who bears the financial consequence. Accept changes nothing about the risk itself. Only the organization's stance from unexamined to deliberate, and mistaking that for an action is the classic error. Question 49. A facilities manager reports that ordinary wear on routine equipment produces small, predictable repair costs that sit comfortably within the organization's stated risk appetite. The risk committee decides to take no special action beyond normal maintenance budgeting. Which risk response is this? Your options are accept, B, avoid, C, transferred, D, reduce. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is A, accept. A is correct because acceptance means taking no special action because the risk sits within the organization's appetite. It is a deliberate decision rather than an oversight, and the difference matters. An accepted risk stays on the register and stays monitored. Treating acceptance as neglect is a common misreading since a knowingly retained risk is being managed. B is wrong because avoidance stops the activity creating the risk, which here would mean ceasing to operate the equipment. That response is wildly disproportionate to predictable minor wear. C is wrong because transfer shifts financial consequence to a third party through insurance or contract. Insuring high-frequency, low-severity costs would cost more in premium and administration than the repairs. D is wrong because reduction lowers likelihood or impact through added controls. The committee explicitly chose no special action, which is the opposite of adding a control. Acceptance has a bad reputation because it produces no visible activity. No new control, no policy, no training session. From the outside, it looks identical to doing nothing. But the difference is entirely internal, and it separates managing a risk from being unaware of one. Accept, also called retain, means taking no special action because the risk sits within the organization's appetite. That means ordinary operating processes continue. The decision references a stated boundary rather than a preference. And someone with authority actively concluded the current level is acceptable. An accepted risk is measured, owned, references appetite, and stays monitored. So if repair frequency starts climbing, someone notices. An ignored exposure has none of that. It is not measured, has no owner, and is not monitored, because nobody knows it's there. Acceptance also has a cost profile in its favor. Controls consume cycle time and attention, insurance consumes premium, and avoidance consumes the objective of the activity served, where an exposure is small relative to appetite. Accepting it preserves resources for risks where a response is actually worth the cost. Transfer moves the financial consequence to a third party for a premium. Accept keeps that consequence in-house for free. Both leave the exposure itself untouched, and the choice turns on whether the potential loss is big enough that paying to move it is worth the price. Question 50. A bank implements multi-factor authentication to reduce account takeover risk, marks the register item closed, and moves on. A year later, attackers adapt their methods and takeovers climb back to prior levels before anyone notices. What does this outcome illustrate about the 6-step process? Your options are: A. The identify step was never completed since the threat was not fully described. B. Implementation is not a finish line, and monitoring is what would have caught the changing risk and fed it back into identification. C. The risk should have been transferred rather than reduced. D. Ownership should have been assigned to the board rather than to management. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is B. Implementation is not a finish line, and monitoring is what would have caught the changing risk and fed it back into identification. B is correct because monitoring tracks on an ongoing basis whether both the risk and the chosen response are still behaving as expected, using periodic reassessment, early warning metrics, audits, and register updates. Closing the item treated a decision as a conclusion. The process is a cycle, and monitoring routinely surfaces new or changing risks that feed straight back into identification. A is wrong because identification clearly succeeded, since the bank recognized account takeover risk and selected a targeted response. The failure came after treatment. C is wrong because transfer would shift financial consequence to a third party without preventing the attacks or detecting their evolution. The reduction choice was reasonable. Abandoning oversight of it was not. D is wrong because the board oversees rather than managing risk day to day, so assigning operational ownership to directors would confuse the two roles. Management ownership was appropriate here. Closing the item is not the same as being safe. A bank rolled out multi-factor authentication, marked the risk closed, and moved on. 12 months later, attackers had adapted, and account takeovers climbed right back to where they started. Monitoring is the 6th step, ongoing tracking of whether the risk and the response are still behaving as expected. Its tools are periodic reassessment, key risk indicators, audits, incident tracking, and register updates. And what unites them is that they recur, because the thing being watched keeps changing. Two distinct things need watching. The risk itself can shift as likelihood, impact, or its driver evolves, and separately, the response can degrade as controls decay, staff turn over, or thresholds go stale. The bank's control worked exactly as designed. It was the threat that moved, and monitoring's real power is that it feeds discovery straight back into identification, turning the sequence into a cycle. Early warning indicators matter because they make monitoring anticipatory instead of retrospective. Tracking losses only tells you what already happened, but tracking precursors like failed authentication attempts, staff turnover, or supplier payment delays gives you time to act before the damage lands. Implementing a fix describes something completed in the past. Being safe is a claim about the future, and nothing about a finished action proves that claim. Risk management is a standing activity, and monitoring is the step where that truth becomes real instead of just stated. That wraps up our question and answer review for Domain 1, Introduction to Risk, Culture, and Risk Standards. If you'd like to practice what we just covered, head over to our website using the link in the description below. There you'll find hundreds of free practice questions, plus complete study guides ready for you to explore. It's a great next step for reinforcing everything you've learned today. So make sure to check it out and put your new knowledge into action. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next video. And good luck on your Enterprise Risk Management exam.